Hey there, tonight we're diving into the haunting echoes of the Salem witch trials, where despite popular tales, no witches were actually burned at the stake. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now get comfortable, perhaps dim the lights, or find that perfect pillow position, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the late 17th century, the town of Salem, Massachusetts, was not the charming, history-soaked tourist spot it is today. Back then, it was a gritty Puritan settlement with as much charm as a damp sock. Picture a place where everyone was so tightly wound that the mere mention of a witch was enough to send them into a tizzy. And boy, did they ever tizzy. Life for the Puritans was a lot like living in a present-day office with a broken coffee machine, a bit bleak and overly serious. These folks had left England seeking religious freedom, but ended up swapping one set of constraints for another. Their days were dictated by a strict adherence to religious practices, which, to be honest, made the average modern-day New Year's resolution look like a walk in the park. They were all about hard work, thrift, and a whole lot of praying. Fun, right? Now, throw into this mix a dash of political instability and economic hardship, and you've got yourself a recipe for one heck of a witch hunt. The 1690 were not exactly booming for New England. The colony was still reeling from the aftermath of King Philip's War, a conflict with Native American tribes that had drained resources and left lingering tensions. Add to that a series of smallpox epidemics and a harsh climate that made farming about as easy as turning lead into gold. The Puritans needed scapegoats like a college student needs caffeine during finals week. Let's talk fashion, or the lack thereof. Puritan attire wasn't exactly runway material. Their wardrobe was a monochromatic affair, black and white, with the occasional grey for those feeling particularly rebellious. It's like they saw a rainbow and thought, let's go with the opposite. But these sartorial choices weren't just about style. They were a reflection of their worldview. They valued modesty and simplicity, believing that vanity was a one-way ticket to eternal damnation. So, while it might have been all the rage to wear buckles on your hat and shoes, it was definitely not about looking snazzy. In this tightly controlled environment, with its drab color palette and stern religious overtones, suspicion was as common as their daily bread. If something went wrong, you didn't call the local tech support. Instead, you might just accuse your neighbor of witchcraft. It was the Puritan version of blaming the Wi-Fi for every tech mishap. And let's face it, the idea of witchcraft was a handy catch-all for anything that couldn't be easily explained. Socio-political stress played its part, too. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was in a constant state of anxiety, like a cat that hears a vacuum cleaner switch on. England was far away, but its influence was keenly felt. The colony's charter had been revoked in 1684, leaving them without a clear legal framework. Essentially, they were left to their own devices, with the Crown's representatives more concerned with the power struggles back home than with a bunch of colonists who had gone a bit feral. This lack of governance left a power vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum almost as much as a cat does. In the absence of clear leadership, the Puritans clung to their religious beliefs even more tightly. And in this context, the devil was seen as a real and present danger. They believed that Satan was actively working to undermine their godly community, which made them as paranoid as a conspiracy theorist with a Wi-Fi connection. Fear of the devil's machinations was so pervasive that every misfortune was attributed to his influence. Cows stopped producing milk. Must be the devil. Crops failed. Satan's at it again. Aunt Betty has a rash. Witchcraft, obviously. These beliefs didn't just spring up out of nowhere. They were rooted in centuries of European witch lore, which was a delightful mix of superstition, folklore, and a healthy dose of misogyny. In Europe, witch trials had been a thing for a while, with tens of thousands of people, mostly women, accused and executed between the 15th and 18th centuries. The Puritans brought these ideas with them across the Atlantic, like a bad souvenir from a European vacation. As the 1690s rolled in, the perfect storm was brewing. The Puritans' strict lifestyle, combined with their socio-political instability and deep-seated fears, set the stage for the hysteria that would soon grip Salem. It was like a pressure cooker, just waiting for someone to crank up the heat. And in 1692, the lid blew off in spectacular fashion. The initial spark came from two young girls, Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, who began exhibiting strange behaviors. They screamed, contorted their bodies, and uttered unintelligible sounds. In today's world, they might have been diagnosed with something medical or psychological. But in 1692 Salem, these antics could only mean one thing: witches. The town collectively clutched its pearls, and the accusations started flying faster than a broomstick on a windy day. It's important to note that these accusations didn't happen in a vacuum. There were pre-existing tensions within the community. Salem Village was a small, claustrophobic community where everybody knew everybody else's business, and grudges were as enduring as a bad tattoo. Land disputes, inheritance squabbles, and local politics all simmered beneath the surface, ready to boil over at the slightest provocation. It was like living in a soap opera, but with more bonnets and less dramatic music. So when the accusations started, they spread like wildfire. Suddenly, no one was safe. If your neighbor's cow kicked the bucket, you might find yourself accused. If someone looked at you funny in church, well, maybe it was time to check if they floated in water. It was a frenzy of finger-pointing, as everyone scrambled to protect themselves and their families. The fear was palpable, and it fed on itself like a snake eating its own tail. The trials themselves were a spectacle of absurdity. Evidence presented included things like spectral evidence, which was testimony that someone's spirit or spectre had visited the accuser. Basically, it was the 17th century version of, "I dreamt you were mean to me, so you must be guilty." This kind of evidence would make any modern-day lawyer's head spin faster than a spinning wheel. But back then, it was taken as seriously as the latest gossip. And let's not overlook the role of the good old Puritan work ethic in this debacle. See, they believed that suffering was a sign of God's favor. So, enduring trials and tribulations was just part of the spiritual journey. The more you suffered, the better your heavenly reward. It was the ultimate in delayed gratification, with the added bonus of possibly getting your neighbor hanged if you played your cards right. As the trials escalated, the number of accused reached dizzying heights. Over 200 people were accused of practicing witchcraft, a staggering number for a community of only a few hundred. In the end, 19 people were hanged, and one man was pressed to death with heavy stones, a particularly gruesome fate, even by Puritan standards. It was a dark chapter in history, fueled by fear, superstition, and a heavy dose of human folly. So why does any of this matter today? Well, the Salem witch trials serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of mass hysteria and scapegoating. It's a reminder that when fear takes over, reason often takes a backseat. And while we might chuckle at the absurdity of it all, it's also a sobering reflection on the darker side of human nature. The Salem witch trials may be centuries behind us, but the echoes of that hysteria still resonate today. It's a testament to the power of fear and how it can warp our perceptions and drive us to commit unthinkable acts. As we delve deeper into this tale of paranoia and tragedy, we'll uncover more about the individuals involved, the trials themselves, and the ultimate fallout from this infamous chapter in history. The Salem witch trials echo through time as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how fear can twist reality like a pretzel at a carnival. But to truly appreciate the bizarre unraveling of this historical melodrama, we need to zero in on what lit the fuse: the strange antics of Betty Paris and Abigail Williams. These two young girls, aged 9 and 11, were the epicenter of chaos, and their behavior was the spark in the powder keg that was Salem. Let's set the scene. It's early 1692, and the Paris household is about as serene as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. Reverend Samuel Paris, Betty's father, wasn't exactly the poster child for Puritan patience. His household was a pressure cooker, and the steam was about to blow. When Betty and her cousin Abigail started having fits, screaming, convulsing, barking like dogs, the local doctor scratched his head and shrugged. His diagnosis: witchcraft, naturally, and so the witch panic was born, kicking and screaming into Salem's consciousness. Now, let's not forget that these girls weren't acting in a vacuum. The Puritans believed the devil was lurking in every shadow, ready to pounce. In this climate, the girls' fits were like setting off fireworks in a tinder-dry forest. The town's reaction was swift, and it didn't take long for accusations to start multiplying like rabbits on a caffeine bender. Enter the legal system, which at this point was as reliable as using a weather vane in a hurricane. The Puritans had a logic all their own, if you can call it that, where spectral evidence reigned supreme. This was the idea that a witch could send their spirit to torment someone, and the afflicted could see this ghostly form. It was like accusing someone of stealing your lunch money because you dreamt they did. But in Salem, this was considered hard evidence. Logic. Who needs it when you have hysteria? Consider this. The court operated under the assumption that the invisible world was just as real as the visible one. It was like living in an M. Night Shyamalan movie, where every twist was more unbelievable than the last. And if you think that sounds ridiculous, remember that this was a time when people believed the Earth was the center of the universe. Perspective wasn't exactly their strong suit. Then there was the infamous witch cake, a culinary crime if ever there was one. This delightful concoction involved mixing rye meal with the urine of the afflicted girls. Yep, you heard that right, and feeding it to a dog. If the dog exhibited the same symptoms as the girls, then witchcraft was confirmed. This was the 17th century equivalent of using a Ouija board to solve a crime. In today's world, that kind of evidence would get you laughed out of court faster than you can say abracadabra. The trials quickly turned into a farce of legal proceedings. The accused were often presumed guilty until proven innocent, an inversion of justice that would make any modern lawyer break out in hives. And what constituted proof? Well, anything from a mole or a wart, known as a witch's teat, to the ability to recite the Lord's Prayer without stumbling, because clearly only a witch would have a stammer when under extreme stress. As the trials gathered momentum, the economic and social tensions within the community became glaringly apparent. Salem Village, where most of the accusations occurred, was rife with disputes over property lines and ministerial salaries. Land was worth its weight in gold, or in this case rye, and these disputes were often masked by witchcraft accusations. Got a beef with your neighbor? Just accuse them of witchcraft and watch their property disputes vanish like smoke on the breeze. And let's not ignore the role of gender here. The majority of the accused were women, often those who didn't quite fit the Puritan mold. They were outspoken, independent, or just plain unlucky. It's almost as if the trials were a convenient way to silence women who dared to step out of line. Misogyny was the unspoken rule of the day, and the witch trials were its grim manifestation. The trials escalated quickly, with judges and juries caught up in the frenzy. The court of Oyer and Termina, set up specifically for these trials, was a kangaroo court, if there ever was one, presided over by judges who were more interested in spectacle than justice. It became a theater of the absurd. It was the 17th century version of a reality show. Each new accusation was another episode, and the stakes were life and death. This mass hysteria also had an economic angle. The trials brought a peculiar kind of prosperity to Salem, as people flocked to the town to witness the proceedings. It was like the world's grimmest tourist attraction. Local businesses thrived on the influx of people, and the trials became a macabre form of entertainment. It's a chilling reminder of how easily profit can be made from human suffering. As the number of accusations mounted, the community's fabric started to tear at the seams. Families were torn apart, friendships shattered, and trust was a thing of the past. The paranoia was contagious, spreading through Salem like wildfire. It was a spectacle of human folly, a dark reflection of the lengths to which fear can drive us. In the end, the Salem witch trials were a tragic chapter in history, a vivid example of what happens when reason is cast aside in favor of fear and superstition. They serve as a reminder that the line between civilization and chaos is thin, and that line can be crossed with alarming ease. As we continue to explore this dark period, we'll uncover more about the individuals caught up in the hysteria, the trials that ensued, and the aftermath that would leave an indelible mark on history. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into the madness of Salem, where reality and illusion became indistinguishable, and the human cost was all too real. As the Salem witch trials continued to spiral out of control, the courtroom became less about justice and more about putting on a show. It was like the Puritan version of reality TV, with everyone tuned in to see who would be accused next. At the heart of this spectacle was the infamous use of spectral evidence, a kind of testimony that seems more at home in a ghost story than a legal proceeding. Witnesses would claim that the accused had sent their spirit to torment them, and this intangible evidence was considered as solid as a granite headstone. Now, you might think that such flimsy evidence would have been laughed out of court faster than a bad dad joke, but you'd be wrong. In fact, it was taken so seriously that it led to the conviction of countless individuals. Why? Well, the Puritans believed that the devil himself was the master puppeteer pulling strings from the shadows. To them, the invisible was just as real as the visible, and spectral evidence was like catching a glimpse of the devil's handiwork. But not everyone was convinced. Enter Judge Samuel Sewall, key figure in the trials, and one of the 9 judges who presided over the court of Oyer and Termina. Sewall was a man of contradictions, torn between his Puritan beliefs and the growing realization that they might be steering the ship straight into the rocks. It wasn't until years later, in 1697, that Sewall publicly repented for his role in the trials, admitting that they'd been a colossal mistake. Better late than never, right? His apology was one of the first steps toward acknowledging the injustice that had taken place, though it came too late for those who'd already met their fate. Among the accused was Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old grandmother who was as threatening as a plate of oatmeal. She was known for her piety and kindness, making her an unlikely candidate for witchcraft. But in Salem, logic had taken a vacation, and anyone could find themselves in the crosshairs. Nurse's trial was a farce, complete with interruptions from the afflicted girls who writhed and screamed on cue, like a macabre play with a captive audience. Despite a jury initially finding her innocent, pressure from the judges led to a reconsideration, and she was ultimately convicted and hanged. It was a stark reminder that in Salem, the scales of justice were rigged against you, even if you had the moral fortitude of a saint. The logistics of these public executions were as awkward as a middle school dance. Gallows Hill became the grim stage where these tragedies unfolded, drawing crowds from near and far. It was an event, a macabre spectacle that people couldn't seem to look away from. The hangings were public, a chilling reminder of the consequences of stepping out of line. But they also served as a grotesque form of entertainment, with onlookers treating the executions like a day at the theater, complete with picnics and gossip. Economic factors also played a significant role in the proceedings. The witch trials were not just a moral panic, but a convenient way to settle old scores and gain financially. Property belonging to the accused could be seized, and debts conveniently forgotten if the debtor happened to be hanged for witchcraft. It was a brutal game of Monopoly, where the losers paid with their lives. The trials, in a twisted sense, were a boon for some, as they provided an opportunity to eliminate rivals and expand one's own holdings. In the end, the Salem witch trials were an explosive combination of fear, superstition, and human folly. They tore the community apart, leaving scars that would linger long after the hysteria had subsided. The trials exposed the dark underbelly of Puritan society, where piety masked paranoia and justice was a distant dream. It's a tale of caution about the dangers of mass hysteria and the human capacity for cruelty when blinded by fear. As we peel back the layers of this historical onion, the pungent aroma of paranoia and injustice becomes even more pronounced. We'll continue to explore the key figures who played starring roles in this tragic drama, the social dynamics that fueled the fire, and the aftermath that left an indelible mark on American history. Stick around as we delve deeper into the chaos of Salem, where truth was stranger than fiction, and reality was as twisted as a corkscrew. As the smoke of paranoia continued to cloud Salem's judgment, the first whispers of skepticism began to cut through the madness like a much-needed breeze. By late 1692, even the staunchest Puritan was starting to wonder if they'd collectively lost the plot. Enter Governor William Phips, the adult finally stepping into a room full of squabbling kids with matches. Phips, fresh from not-so-glorious campaigns against the French in Canada, must have looked at the chaos of Salem and thought, really, this is what you've done with the place while I was gone. Phips had returned to Massachusetts to find his colony in a full-blown witch panic, and the courtroom drama more farcical than a bad reality show. By October, even he could see that spectral evidence was about as reliable as an infomercial promise. So, he did what any sensible leader would do, and dissolved the court of Oyer and Termina, effectively pulling the plug on the witch hunt extravaganza. It was like cutting the power during a DJ's set at a frat party. Everyone was left blinking in the sudden silence, wondering what on earth they'd been dancing to. As Phipps slammed the brakes on the trials, it was clear that the whole affair had spiraled into a colossal blunder. The governor's intervention marked the beginning of a slow, painful process of untangling the mess. He established a new court, the Superior Court of Judicature, and crucially, barred spectral evidence as admissible in trials. This was a game-changer. Without the ghostly testimonies that had fueled the fire, the accusations began to fizzle out like a poorly lit firecracker. The aftermath of the trials was a period of awkward reflection. It was like waking up with a hangover and piecing together the embarrassing events of the previous night. The townsfolk gradually came to grips with the fact that they'd let fear and superstition turn their community into a horror show. By May 1693, Phipps had pardoned the remaining accused witches, essentially saying, "My bad, folks. Let's pretend this never happened, shall we?" But pretending was easier said than done. The trials had left a trail of destruction, families torn apart, reputations shattered, and let's not forget, 19 people dead and 1 crushed under stones. It was the kind of civic trauma that doesn't just blow over. Even the Puritans, with their love of suffering, had to admit this was taking things a bit too far. The colony staggered forward, trying to sew its society back together, while ignoring the gaping hole left by its collective bout of insanity. In a twist of irony, the trials served as a grim lesson in governance and justice, or the lack thereof. Governor Phipps, likely feeling the heat from the crown, recognized that his colony needed a serious PR overhaul. After all, England was already skeptical of these upstart colonists playing judge, jury, and executioner. There was a growing realization that maybe, just maybe, letting a bunch of scared villagers dictate legal proceedings wasn't the best idea. Meanwhile, across the pond, England itself was no stranger to witch trials, but public sentiment there was shifting towards skepticism. The English were starting to roll their eyes at witch hunts, much like how we view those miracle diet ads today. The Salem debacle only accelerated this shift, prompting a re-evaluation of what constituted justice. It was like someone finally saying, "Okay, enough with the witch nonsense. Let's get back to the real problems, like the French." Back in Salem, the cultural fallout was as sticky as molasses. Families who had lost loved ones to the gallows had to navigate a community that was both their home and the site of their worst nightmares. It was like living in a ghost town, where the real ghosts were the memories of betrayal and fear. For the survivors, seeking restitution was a long and arduous process, marked by petitions and apologies from those who had once held the nooses. In 1702, the General Court of Massachusetts declared the trials unlawful, which was a bit like saying water is wet, obvious but necessary. This official acknowledgement was followed by a day of fasting and soul-searching in 1697, where Judge Sewall publicly confessed his regret in a deeply Puritan fashion. It was a classic case of too little, too late, but at least it was something. It was like offering a band-aid for a bullet wound, better than nothing, but not much comfort to the dead. The economic ramifications were also significant. Salem's reputation had taken a hit, and the trials had left an indelible mark on its economy. The legal costs and the disruption to daily life had drained resources and sowed distrust. It was a cautionary tale of how fear and greed can scorch the earth, leaving behind a barren landscape of regret and recrimination. Yet, even as Salem tried to move on, the specter of the trials lingered. It was a reminder of how easily reason can be eclipsed by hysteria, and how quickly justice can turn into a travesty. The witch trials became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked power and the human tendency to scapegoat in times of crisis. It was a dark chapter that served as a warning to future generations. Beware the seductive allure of certainty in a world of uncertainty. As for the Puritans, they continued to wrestle with their complex legacy. The trials were a stark example of the extremes to which their rigid worldview could lead. Even as they sought redemption through confession and repentance, the shadow of the witch hunts loomed large. It was a burden they would carry for generations, a testament to the perils of letting fear dictate action. In the years that followed, the story of Salem became a powerful cautionary tale, retold and reimagined through the ages. It was a saga that spoke to the darker corners of the human psyche, where fear and fanaticism can lead even the most devout astray. The trials became a symbol of the eternal struggle between reason and superstition, a reminder that history is often a mirror reflecting our best and worst selves. As we look back on the Salem witch trials, we're reminded of the thin line between civilization and chaos, and the importance of vigilance in safeguarding justice. The story of Salem is not just one of tragedy and misjudgment, but also of the resilience of the human spirit in confronting past mistakes. It's a reminder that even in the darkest times, there's a path to redemption if only we have the courage to take it. Stick around as we continue to unravel the threads of this historical tapestry, exploring the echoes of Salem that still resonate in our world today. But what happens when the past refuses to stay buried? The Salem witch trials left more than just a faint echo in the annals of history. They forged a cultural legacy that still haunts the American psyche like an old ghost story told around a campfire. The trials are a grim reminder of humanity's penchant for scapegoating in times of uncertainty, a tendency that, sadly, remains as timeless as a classic rock anthem. The resonance of Salem's hysteria stretches across centuries, shaping not only legal reforms, but also seeping into the cultural zeitgeist like ink spilled on parchment. The legal impact of the Salem witch trials can't be overstated. Picture a legal system that had been operating with the grace of a bull in a china shop, finally getting a much-needed manual on how not to ruin everything. The trials highlighted the glaring need for due process and evidentiary standards, prompting a slow but sure shift toward a more rational legal framework. By the time the Constitution rolled around, the Founding Fathers had learned a thing or two from Salem's blunders, enshrining protections against such miscarriages of justice in the Bill of Rights. The Sixth Amendment, with its promise of a fair trial, was a direct counter to the kangaroo court antics of 1692. And let's be real, who doesn't appreciate a good lesson in not letting spectral evidence dictate life and death decisions? Culturally, the Salem witch trials have been mythologized to the point where they've become a staple of American folklore, with as much staying power as a pop culture icon. Enter Arthur Miller's The Crucible, a play that took the historical events of Salem and turned them into a fiery critique of McCarthyism. Written in 1953, during the height of the Red Scare, Miller used the trials as an allegory to highlight the dangers of mass hysteria and ideological witch hunts. The play became a classroom classic, ensuring that generations of students would forever associate Puritans with paranoia and pointy hats. Yet, Miller's work also romanticized the trials, painting them with broad strokes that sometimes blurred the lines between fact and fiction. But hey, who doesn't love a good dramatic retelling, even if it's a bit loose with the details? Then there's the modern-day portrayal of witches, which has evolved from sinister outcasts to something more akin to quirky cultural icons. Just take a stroll through any Halloween store, and you'll find an array of witch costumes that bear little resemblance to the grim reality of those who were accused in Salem. Today's witches have traded in their hangman's nooses for broomsticks and black cats, becoming a symbol of empowerment and rebellion. It's a testament to how cultural narratives can shift over time, transforming symbols of fear into emblems of independence. In a way, it's a reclamation of a dark past, turning the tables on a history that once condemned the different and the defiant. But while the witch trials have been wrapped in the cozy cloak of legend, the harsh reality of Salem is a potent reminder of how history can loop back on itself, often with less supernatural flair, but equally absurd motivations. Consider the moral panics that have gripped society since, from the Red Scare to the Satanic Panic of the 1900 AD, where daycare workers were accused of bizarre rituals based on flimsy evidence and mass hysteria. The echoes of Salem are unmistakable, a stark reminder that human nature has a nasty habit of recycling its worst impulses. Yet, the legacy of Salem is not just one of cautionary tales and cultural adaptations. It's also a story of resilience and reflection, a testament to how societies can learn from their darkest chapters. The Massachusetts legislature eventually exonerated the condemned witches, a move that was both a symbolic gesture and an attempt to heal the wounds inflicted by fear and ignorance. It's a reminder that, While history may not always repeat itself, it certainly rhymes, and it's up to us to ensure we're not just singing the same old tune. As we draw the curtain on this tale of hysteria and redemption, it's worth pondering the lessons Salem offers. It's a story that speaks to the dangers of certainty in a world that's anything but a cautionary note about the perils of letting fear and superstition cloud our judgment. But it's also a testament to the power of redemption and the human capacity for growth, even in the face of our darkest instincts. So, as we put this chapter to rest, let's remember that history is not just a record of what was, but a guide to what can be, if we're willing to learn from the past and forge a future that's just a bit wiser and perhaps a bit kinder. If you ever wondered who really set the stage for Rome's dramatic historical performance, look no further than the Etruscans. Yes, the Etruscans, those enigmatic trailblazers from the Italian peninsula who strutted their stuff around the 8th century BCE, long before the Romans swaggered into the spotlight. Picture a grand civilization that thrived in what we now call Tuscany, a place where city-states like Tarquinia and Veii were the talk of the town, or should we say, the terror. The Etruscans were like that mysterious neighbor who throws the best parties but never spills their secrets. Their origins are debated more fervently than whether pineapple belongs on pizza. Some scholars suggest they drifted in from Anatolia, while others argue they were homegrown Italians, the real OGs of the region. Regardless, by the time the historical curtain rose, the Etruscans had already set up shop with a network of city-states, each more culturally rich than the last. In terms of architecture, these guys were practically the HGTV stars of the ancient world. They introduced the arch, a structural innovation that the Romans later adopted like it was the newest iPhone model. Temples, too, carried the Etruscan stamp, with their high podiums and deep porches, a design that the Romans borrowed and modified faster than you can say cultural appropriation. When you look at Rome's architectural marvels, from the Colosseum to the aqueducts, you're actually seeing the Etruscan influence etched in stone. Those aqueducts, by the way, were not just fancy water slides. They were the lifeline of urban centers, a marvel of engineering that made Roman cities buzz with life. But let's not stop at stones and arches. Ever wonder about Roman fashion? The toga, that quintessential Roman garment, wasn't exactly an original Roman concept. The Etruscans were swanning around in similar garb long before Rome was even a blip on the Mediterranean map. Etruscan fashion was all about the flow. They knew how to drape fabric in a way that made even a stroll to the market look like a runway walk. This style evolution wasn't just about looking good. It was about embodying social status and identity, a concept the Romans eagerly embraced. And speaking of status, the Etruscans had a complex social structure, with aristocrats who knew how to throw lavish banquets that would make a Roman senator blush. These events were more than just feasts. They were the social media of the time, a way to network and show off. It was all about who had the best silverware and the choicest cuts of meat. The Romans, always ready to take notes on a good party, adopted these customs with gusto. In short, the Etruscans were more than just a footnote in the backstory of Rome. They were the authors of the prequel. They influenced everything from architecture and infrastructure to fashion and social customs. So, next time you gaze at the Roman ruins and marvel at their grandeur, spare a thought for the Etruscans, the unsung heroes who laid the groundwork for the Roman Empire's eventual rise to global fame. It's a bit like appreciating the opening act after the headliner has left the stage. Now, let's step into the political arena, where the Etruscans were like the original social media influencers, shaping Roman society long before hashtags were a thing. The Etruscans had a knack for governance that was as intricate as their jewelry. Their cities were ruled by kings, or lucumons, who were essentially the rock stars of the Etruscan world. Think of them as the ancient equivalent of a celebrity CEO. These guys didn't just sit on their gilded thrones. They were deeply involved in religious rituals, acting as high priests. Now, this wasn't just because they fancied themselves the spiritual type. Religion and politics were a package deal, a bit like buying a phone and getting a free case. Only this case came with a heavy dose of divine legitimacy. The Etruscans' political system was a cocktail of monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy, shaken, not stirred. Each city-state had its own assembly of elders, the Senate, if you will, which advised the king. Sound familiar? You bet it does. The Romans later adopted this model and called it their Senate, claiming it as the backbone of their republic. But let's be real, the Romans were like that friend who borrows your playlist and claims they discovered all the tracks. The Roman Republic, often hailed as the epitome of political innovation, was more of a remix than an original composition. Etruscan kings didn't just boss people around. They were also major patrons of public works, commissioning projects that would have made even the most ambitious Roman engineers green with envy. Roads, temples, and public buildings sprouted up under their reigns, laying down the infrastructure for future Roman glory. These kings knew that a solid road system was worth its weight in gold, both for moving armies and for lining their pockets with trade profits. Speaking of profits, the Etruscans were savvy traders, dealing in goods like iron, copper, and silver. They were the original import-export moguls, with their eyes on the Mediterranean prize. But why stop at roads and trade when you can play a little gladiatorial combat? The Etruscans were all about that life-and-death drama, and they loved a good fight. Forget the sanitized version of gladiators as noble warriors. The Etruscans knew it was all about the spectacle. These events were part ritual, part entertainment, and completely riveting. When a high-ranking Etruscan died, they didn't just go quietly into the night. Instead, they threw a bash that involved combat, because nothing says, "I honor you," like watching someone get pummeled in an arena. The Romans, of course, took this idea and ran with it, turning gladiatorial games into the blockbuster events of ancient times. As for the myth of Roman innovation, let's debunk it with a flourish. The Romans were excellent at repackaging Etruscan ideas, slapping on a Roman label and calling it a day. It's a bit like slapping a new logo on an old product. They understood the power of branding, turning Etruscan traditions like augury, the art of interpreting the will of the gods through bird patterns, into an integral part of their state religion. It's not that they lacked creativity. They just knew a good thing when they saw it. Religion was the glue that held Etruscan society together, influencing everything from politics to public life. They were the OGs of ritualistic pageantry. Their pantheon was as crowded as a modern-day comic convention, with gods and goddesses for every occasion. They practiced haruspicy, the art of reading omens from the entrails of sacrificed animals. Sounds grim, perhaps, but it was all in a day's work for an Etruscan priest. This practice was absorbed into Roman culture too, proving once again that the Etruscans were the trendsetters of the ancient world. In the grand scheme of things, the Etruscans didn't just pass the baton to Rome, they carved the path. They were the unsung architects of the Roman Republic, the silent partners in what would become one of history's greatest empires. In the end, the Etruscans gave Rome the tools it needed to build its mythic identity, complete with grandiose tales of heroism and conquest. But behind every Roman triumph lurked the shadow of Etruscan genius, waiting for the world to finally recognize their place in history's spotlight. Now, as we dive into the Etruscans' economic prowess, imagine them as the ancient equivalent of a bustling startup hub, only with fewer ping-pong tables and more olive oil amphorae. These folks were the original tycoons of trade, operating a network that stretched like a well-oiled machine from the Mediterranean to the Greek world. Picture their ships, not as mere vessels, but as the ancient world's FedEx fleet, delivering everything from wine and pottery to iron and gold. They were the middlemen of the Mediterranean, and like any good middleman, they knew how to keep the profits flowing into their coffers. Let's talk numbers. The Etruscans managed to control a significant portion of the copper and iron trade, two resources harder than a Roman summer. Their mines, particularly those in Elba and the surrounding areas, were like gold mines, only, with actual iron and copper. These metals were the lifeblood of weaponry and tools, making the Etruscans indispensable to both neighbors and rivals. They didn't just mine, they refined and crafted, turning raw materials into highly sought-after goods. If you needed a top-notch sword or a plow that wouldn't snap in half, the Etruscans had you covered. Their trading prowess wasn't just about shipping goods, it was about building connections. Etruscan merchants were the ultimate networkers, rubbing elbows with Greek traders, Carthaginians, and even the odd Phoenician. They had their own league of city-states, the Etruscan League, which wasn't just a political alliance, but an economic powerhouse that governed trade and commerce like a multinational corporation. This network was a spider's web of influence, ensuring that Etruscan products reached every corner of the Mediterranean. It was all about who you knew and who you could trade with, and the Etruscans knew everyone. But here's the kicker. This economic success didn't just fill Etruscan treasuries. It had a ripple effect that enriched Rome too. As the Romans expanded, they absorbed these trade routes and the wealth that came with them like a sponge. By the time Rome hit its stride, it was sitting on a commercial network that had been meticulously crafted by the Etruscans over centuries. It's like inheriting a turnkey business. Rome got a head start thanks to the groundwork laid by their predecessors. Now, mining wasn't just a gold rush. It was a grueling enterprise that required manpower and often brute force. The Etruscans knew this all too well, employing slaves and lower-class citizens to dig, refine, and transport materials. It was back-breaking work, but for the Etruscan elite, it was the price of doing business. This system of labor, harsh as it was, fed the economic engine of their civilization, allowing the Etruscans to fund all those lavish banquets and grandiose projects we mentioned earlier. Speaking of price tags, let's not gloss over the cost of Roman expansion into Etruscan territories. You see, Rome didn't just wake up one day and decide to annex Etruria for kicks and giggles. It was a strategic move, fueled by a hunger for resources and trade routes. The Romans saw the wealth of Etruria and thought, why share the pie when you can have the whole bakery? But conquering wasn't cheap. It required armies, and armies needed to be paid, fed, and equipped. The Roman expansion into Etruscan lands was a costly affair, both financially and in terms of human lives. Yet the Romans believed the potential for economic gain outweighed these costs, a gamble that, in the long run, paid off in spades. In taking over Etruscan territories, the Romans didn't just gain land, they acquired a cultural and economic legacy. It's a bit like buying a house and finding out it comes with a priceless art collection. The Etruscans had spent centuries perfecting their crafts, and the Romans were more than happy to adopt these practices, often passing them off as their own innovations. It wasn't just about taking over, it was about integrating and, dare I say, improving upon what the Etruscans had built. And let's not forget the economic implications of Etruscan religious practices. Their elaborate temples weren't just places of worship, they were economic centers. Festivals and rituals attracted visitors, and visitors meant business. Local merchants would have their stalls set up faster than you can say sacrificial lamb, ready to sell their wares to the pious and the curious alike. Religion and economy danced a delicate waltz in Etruscan society, each step carefully orchestrated to ensure prosperity. As we peel back the layers of Etruscan society, it becomes clear that their influence on Rome was multifaceted. They were innovators, traders, and miners who laid the economic foundations for what would become one of history's most powerful empires. They weren't just a footnote. They were the chapter that set the stage for Rome's meteoric rise. So, next time you think of Rome's grandeur, remember the Etruscans, the original architects of success, and the unsung heroes who turned the wheels of history with their trade and innovation. In the grand tapestry of Roman culture, the Etruscans were the master weavers, crafting threads of art and religion that Rome would later flaunt as its own. Let's start with the art scene, because honestly, who doesn't love a good pottery scandal? The Etruscans were the rock stars of the ancient art world, their creations so coveted that they made today's art forgers look like amateurs. Their pottery, particularly the black figure and red figure styles, wasn't just functional. It was an expression of identity, a celebration of gods, myths, and everyday life. These pieces were as much a symbol of status as they were of skill, and the Romans took notice faster than you can say cultural appropriation. Now, when we talk about Etruscan art, we're not just talking about clay and kilns. Their bronze sculptures were nothing short of legendary. Take the Chimera of Arezzo, a bronze masterpiece dating back to the 5th century BCE. This snarling beast, part lion, part goat, and part serpent, wasn't just a display piece. It was a symbol of the Etruscan ability to blend myth with craftsmanship. The Romans saw these works and realized they had some serious catching up to do. They began to replicate Etruscan styles, producing art that celebrated their own gods and heroes, yet always with a nod to their Etruscan predecessors. It was a bit like modern-day Hollywood remakes. Originality was optional, as long as the spectacle was there. Moving on to the mystical side of things, the Etruscans were the original mystics of the Mediterranean. Their religious practices were as intricate as a Byzantine mosaic and just as colourful. Haruspicy, the art of divining the future through the entrails of sacrificed animals, particularly livers, was one of their most fascinating contributions to Roman religious life. It sounds grim, sure, but in a world where the gods were believed to control everything from the harvest to the outcome of battles, you'd want all the divine insight you could get. The Etruscans were the ancient world's fortune tellers, the Goda soothsayers who could turn a sheep's liver into a prophecy. Romans, ever practical, adopted this practice with open arms, incorporating it into their state ceremonies. It's hard to imagine Caesar's fate being sealed without a little liver reading on the side. And speaking of cultural exchange, let's talk about the Latin alphabet, a cornerstone of Western civilization that owes a debt to the Etruscans. The Etruscans didn't invent writing, but they sure knew how to adapt it. Borrowing from the Greek alphabet, they created their own script, which eventually influenced the Latin alphabet we know today. This wasn't just about communication. It was about power, administration, and control. The written word was a tool for governance and trade, and the Romans, recognizing its value, took the Etruscan system and refined it. In doing so, they laid the groundwork for a language that would dominate Europe for centuries. It's a bit like inheriting your grandfather's old typewriter and turning it into a global publishing empire. But the Etruscans' influence wasn't just about style and scripts. It was about substance. Their religious and artistic contributions were woven into the very fabric of Roman identity. Take the Roman pantheon, for example. Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva may have been the headliners, but many of their divine traits were cribbed from Etruscan deities. This wasn't just cultural borrowing. It was a strategic move to assimilate and unify the diverse peoples of the Italian peninsula under a common religious banner. The Romans, ever the pragmatists, understood that a shared belief system was the glue that could hold an empire together. So, the next time you marvel at a Roman temple or admire a piece of ancient art, remember that the Etruscans were the unsung heroes behind Rome's artistic and religious revolution. They didn't just pass the torch, they lit the way. Their legacy is a testament to their ingenuity and their profound impact on one of history's greatest civilizations. As we peel back the layers of Roman culture, we find that the Etruscans were not just a footnote in history. They were the authors of an entire chapter, setting the stage for Rome's rise with their art, their religion, and their visionary adaptation of the written word. Now, as we pivot to the Etruscan legacy, let's dive into how they left a mark deeper than a Roman aqueduct. These folks didn't just fade into the misty backdrop of history. They were the architects of Rome's cultural scaffolding, even if Rome later tried to paint over their contributions with a fresh coat of Roman glory. Picture the Roman Republic as a rising star in the ancient world. Garbling up Etruscan influence like it was an all-you-can-eat cultural buffet. The Etruscans were, in many ways, the unsung heroes providing the soundtrack to Rome's meteoric rise. But here's the kicker. As Rome strutted its way to empire status, it conveniently forgot to send the Etruscans a thank you note. This wasn't just an oversight. It was a classic case of historical amnesia, where the conqueror's narrative took center stage and the contributions of the conquered slipped quietly into the shadows. Now, let's talk about why history often favors the conqueror's narrative. Spoiler alert. It's not because the winners write the best stories. It's because they get to write the stories, period. When Rome absorbed Etruria, it wasn't just plundering cities, it was assimilating a culture. But it also meant that the Romans could cherry-pick the best bits of Etruscan life, slap a Roman label on them, and call it their own. This kind of historical rebranding is as old as time, and it's a reminder that history, like fashion, is often about who wore it better, or at least who claimed they did. The Etruscans, with their penchant for innovation and cultural flair, were more than just the stepping stones to Roman greatness. They were the blueprint. From their political systems to their religious rituals, the Etruscans laid the groundwork for what would become the Roman way of life. Their city-states, each governed by a lucumo, were the precursors to Roman governance structures. The Etruscans were the original city planners, designing urban spaces that prioritized public life, a concept the Romans would take and run with, eventually paving the way for the sprawling urban centers of the Roman Empire. What about the Etruscan fade into history? It was about as gradual as a sunset, but with a lot more intrigue. By the 4th century BCE, Etruscan power was waning, a casualty of Roman expansionism and internal strife. The Romans, ever the opportunists, saw the Etruscans' disunity as a chance to swoop in and take control. It wasn't just about military conquest, it was a strategic absorption. The Romans were like cultural sponges, soaking up everything from Etruscan engineering to their guards. By the time the Etruscans were fully integrated into the Roman Republic, their unique identity was diluted, their innovations attributed to Rome, the new kid on the block. So, what's the takeaway here? First, let's debunk the myth that Rome was an island of innovation in a sea of mediocrity. The Romans were master adapters, sure, but their so-called original ideas often had Etruscan fingerprints all over them. The arch, the toga, the gladiatorial games, these weren't Roman inventions, they were Etruscan gifts. Rome's architectural prowess, its social customs, and even its guards bore the unmistakable mark of Etruscan genius. And what of the romantic notion that the Etruscans simply vanished into history's ether? The truth is less poetic. They didn't disappear, they were absorbed, their culture woven into the fabric of Roman life. It's a bit like a band breaking up, and its members going on to have solo careers. The Etruscans didn't vanish. They evolved, becoming part of the Roman story, even as their own faded into history's margins. As we wrap up this historical jaunt, let's take a moment to appreciate the Etruscans' role in setting Rome on its imperial path. They were the silent partners in Rome's rise, the uncredited authors of a cultural epic that spanned centuries. The roads that led to Rome were paved with Etruscan stones. The temples that dotted the Roman landscape bore Etruscan designs. Even the Roman Senate, that august body of governance, was an echo of Etruscan political innovation. In the end, the Etruscans left a legacy as enduring as it was overlooked. They were the artisans of antiquity, the dreamers who dared to imagine a world beyond their city walls. Their impact on Rome was profound, shaping an empire that would dominate the ancient world and echo through the ages. So, as you ponder the grandeur of Rome, remember the Etruscans, the original artisans of empire, the unsung heroes of history, whose legacy remains etched in the stones and stories of a civilization long gone but never forgot. Ah, the Victorian era, a time when Britain was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the Industrial Revolution. But behind the curtain of progress and prosperity, there was a seedy underbelly teeming with, well, actual vermin. Think of it as the grittier side of a Dickens novel, but with more squeaking. In the mid-19th century, cities like London were swelling faster than a sponge in a monsoon. The population of London alone ballooned from about 1 million in 1800 to over 3 million by 1850. People flocked to the city for jobs, only to find themselves crammed into what could generously be called housing, and less generously be called a health hazard waiting to happen. The infrastructure was about as prepared for this influx as a noodle in a sword fight, and it showed in the streets, crowded, dirty, and soaked with the stench of open sewage. Yes, the air was so thick with coal smoke and the scent of human misery, you could almost chew it. Enter the rat catcher, the unsung hero, or perhaps more accurately, the underappreciated grunt of the Victorian urban landscape. With overcrowded slums and a sanitation system that took its cues from a Jackson Pollock painting, rats weren't just a problem. They were practically the landlords. These rodents thrived in the labyrinthine sprawl of city life, feeding off human waste and spreading diseases like flea-borne Santa Clauses, but without the jolly cheer. Now, you might think catching rats would be a job for the faint-hearted or the soft-headed, but you'd be wrong. This was a task that required cunning, resilience, and a stomach as strong as an ox's hide. Not to mention, it came with all the glamour of a mud wrestling contest in a tuxedo. Socially, rat catchers were about as popular as a skunk at a garden party. They were essential yet shunned, employed yet impoverished. In other words, they were the unsung laborers keeping the urban ecosystem from collapsing under the weight of its own filth. And speaking of wages, let's talk numbers. Rat catchers earned a pittance, often just a few shillings a week. A shilling back then was worth about 12 pence, and considering a loaf of bread cost around 9 pence, you can see how these folks were living dangerously close to the edge of starvation. It wasn't so much that they were making ends meet, as it was that ends were giving each other a polite nod from across the room. There was also the little matter of social stigma. Much like today's pest control workers, rat catchers were given a wide berth, but not because of any respect for their skills. Rather, their profession was considered dirty work, both literally and figuratively. But when the alternative was watching your children play tag with typhus, you'd be grateful for these brave souls risking life and limb to keep the rat population in check. Industrialization turned cities into teeming hives of activity, but it also made them perfect breeding grounds for vermin. Factories spewed out smoke and workers at a dizzying rate, but they also added to the mess and chaos. The combination of increased production and poor waste management meant that rats found themselves in their version of paradise. If you were a rat, life was a buffet. If you were a rat catcher, it was a never-ending battle against an army that replenished itself faster than you could say, pass the poison. The Victorian era might be romanticized as the age of innovation and progress, but for the rat catchers, it was a slog through filth and disease, often with nothing but a stick and a terrier by their side. And if you think that sounds like a bad joke, you wouldn't be far off the mark. It was a grim necessity born from the very advancements that were supposed to herald a new dawn of human achievement. So, the next time you hear about the marvels of the Industrial Revolution, spare a thought for the rat catchers, those unsung custodians of cleanliness who toiled in the shadows, catching rats and dodging disdain, all while keeping the wheels of progress turning, albeit grudgingly. Because if there's one thing history teaches us, it's that greatness often comes with a side of grit. And speaking of grit, let's delve into the nitty-gritty of the rat catcher's toolkit, a veritable arsenal of bizarre and brutal contraptions that make modern pest control look like a spa day. First up, the trusty terrier. Before you imagine a pampered pooch prancing through Westminster, picture a scrappy, wiry-haired beast bred for one thing, rat annihilation. These dogs were the Rambo of rodents, trained to sniff out and dispatch vermin with jaw-snapping efficiency. A single terrier could dispatch hundreds of rats in a night, making them as indispensable as they were irreplaceable. It wasn't just a dog's life, it was a dog's calling. But the terrier wasn't working alone. Enter the traps, which ranged from the rudimentary to the Rube Goldberg-esque. Spring traps, pit traps, and the ominously named guillotine traps were just a few of the tools in a rat catcher's repertoire. Spring traps, for example, were as straightforward as they sound. A metal mechanism that snapped shut with bone-crushing force, much like a Victorian bear trap, but for smaller bears. These contraptions were set with bait, maybe a bit of cheese, or something particularly pungent, like spoiled meat. After all, if the rats were going to meet their maker, they might as well have a Last Supper worth the name. And then there was rat poison, or, as I like to call it, the Victorian version of Russian roulette. This toxic cocktail often contained substances like arsenic or strychnine, which were as deadly as they were indiscriminate. The problem: rats are notoriously clever and often nibbled cautiously, allowing them to escape with their lives and a newfound knowledge of what not to eat. Not to mention, the use of poison was a bit like throwing a grenade into a crowded room, not exactly the precision strike one might hope for. The collateral damage could include pets, livestock, and occasionally an unfortunate human who didn't read the label. The science behind these methods was, well, about as scientific as a seance. It was a time when the understanding of disease was just coming into focus, and the germ theory of disease was still in its infancy. Rat catchers were essentially working in the dark, armed with little more than superstition and hearsay. This lack of scientific grounding didn't stop them from innovating, though. They were the MacGyvers of their day, using whatever materials they could scrounge to build better, more efficient rat-capturing devices. Necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention, or in this case, the mother of a rat-catcher's ingenuity. And speaking of necessity, let's not ignore the cultural fascination with rats that permeated Victorian society. Enter the world of rat baiting, a blood sport that was the 19th century equivalent of pay-per-view boxing. Imagine a pit, a horde of frenzied rats, and a terrier in the starring role. Spectators would place bets on how many rats the dog could kill in a set period, cheering on the carnage like it was the latest must-see spectacle. This gruesome pastime was so popular that it drew audiences from all walks of life, from the working class to the aristocracy. It's a stark reminder that the Victorians had an appetite for entertainment that was as voracious as the rats they despised. But why were rats such a cultural touchstone? Part of it was practical. The little beasts were everywhere. And part of it was psychological. Rats represented the chaos and filth of urban life, a creeping menace that threatened the Victorian ideal of order and progress. In a way, rat catchers were battling more than just rodents. They were fighting a symbolic war against the decay and disorder that lurked in the shadows of industrialization. Now, you might be wondering about the economic side of things. The rat-catching business was, in a word, precarious. Catchers were paid by the number of rats they caught, leading to a rather perverse incentive structure. Imagine living in a world where your livelihood depended on the very infestation you were trying to eradicate. It's like a firefighter getting paid per fire, a system that practically begs for a bit of moral flexibility. Some catchers, as you might expect, started breeding rats on the sly to ensure an endless supply of clients. It's a classic case of job security, Victorian style. Create your own demand. Despite the undeniable grimness, there was a certain rugged romance to the profession. Rat catchers were the urban cowboys of their day, riding into the streets with their terriers and traps, ready to do battle with the verminous hordes. They became folk heroes and villains in equal measure, celebrated for their bravery and vilified for their association with filth and disease. Yet, for all their trials and tribulations, rat catchers were crucial to the health and safety of Victorian cities. Without their tireless efforts, the cities might have been overrun, and the spread of disease might have been even more rampant. They were the unsung custodians of a society that was still trying to understand the balance between progress and its unintended consequences. So, as we unpack the everyday life of a Victorian rat catcher, remember that behind every grimy job is a story of survival, ingenuity, and sometimes a touch of madness. These were the people who navigated the murky waters of urban life with little more than a terrier and a trap, laying the groundwork for the pest control systems we often take for granted today. As we move forward, we'll continue to explore the peculiar and perilous world they inhabited, with all its quirks and contradictions. Because, let's face it, in the grand tapestry of history, every thread, no matter how grimy, has its place. So, as we unpack the everyday life of a Victorian rat catcher, remember that behind every grimy job is a story of survival, ingenuity, and sometimes a touch of madness. These were the people who navigated the murky waters of urban life with little more than a terrier and a trap, laying the groundwork for the pest control systems we often take for granted today. As we move forward, we'll continue to explore the peculiar and perilous world they inhabited, with all its quirks and contradictions. Because, let's face it, in the grand tapestry of history, every thread, no matter how grimy, has its place. But let's not romanticize their plight too much just yet. This wasn't some sepia-toned adventure with a jaunty tune whistling in the background. No, being a Victorian rat catcher was more like starring in a horror film that never ended. These folks were knee-deep in what can only be described as a rat-induced nightmare. With every whiskered adversary they vanquished, they faced a very real, microscopic menace. Disease. And not just any disease, mind you. We're talking about the kind that would make even the most hardened Netflix horror fan squirm. Let's start with the infamous bubonic plague, the rock star of rat-borne illnesses. You might remember this little charmer from its European tour in the 14th century, where it garnered quite the reputation for devastating populations. By the Victorian era, it was like a washed-up rock band making a comeback tour, still deadly, still terrifying, and still spreading panic. The plague, carried by fleas that hitchhiked on rats, was like death's own personal express delivery service. Buboes, those nasty, swollen lymph nodes, were a telltale sign that this unwelcome guest had arrived. And if you were a rat catcher, you were practically rolling out the red carpet for it every day. Yet, it wasn't just the plague that kept rat catchers up at night. There was an entire rogues gallery of afflictions lurking in the shadows, ready to pounce. Typhus, spread by lice, was another uninvited guest at this grim party. Known as jail fever, it thrived in the overcrowded and unsanitary conditions of Victorian cities. And let's not forget leptospirosis, a bacterial infection spread through rat urine. Yes, you heard that right. Rat pee. It's enough to make you rethink your entire career path, isn't it? The daily grind for these rat catchers was fraught with danger, and not just from the diseases they were inadvertently courting. Physical injuries were par for the course. Rat bites were about as common as a cup of tea, and these weren't just love nibbles. Rats have teeth that can gnaw through concrete, so imagine what they could do to a human finger. And while we're on the subject, let's talk about the conditions they worked in. Picture cramped, dark alleys, basements that smelled like a cheese factory gone wrong, and sewers that could double as set pieces in a horror movie. In this environment, a rat catcher was more likely to trip over their own feet than part of gold. Now, if you're imagining these rat catchers as lone wolves, trudging through the gloom with nothing but a grim determination and a sturdy stick, think again. This was a family affair for many. You had entire families involved in the rat-catching business, because why not spread the joy of potential disease and bodily harm among loved ones? Children, often used to crawl into the tightest spaces, were part of the team. It's like a twisted version of Bring Your Child to Work Day, only with more rodents and fewer take-your-kid-to-work selfies. And yet, despite all these risks, there's that pesky myth of the heroic rat catcher, sort of Victorian-era superhero without the cape or the dental plan. Sure, they had their moments, like the time Jack Black, no, not the actor, but the famous Victorian rat catcher was lionized for his skills. Black claimed to have caught rats in the Queen's own kitchen, earning him a sort of folk hero status. But hold on to your top hats, because the reality was far less glamorous. The truth is, rat catchers were more like the gritty anti-heroes of their day, respected occasionally, feared, certainly, admired, not so much. They were necessary, but not necessarily beloved. And why the disconnect? Well, it's the classic case of appreciating the service, but not the server. Much like a modern-day janitor at a rock concert, everyone wants a clean venue, but no one wants to think about the person doing the cleaning. These rat catchers were fighting more than just vermin. They were battling societal disdain and the stigma of a job that was absolutely essential, but far from exalted. In breaking down this romanticized view, it's clear that being a rat catcher was less about heroics and more about survival. It was a job that was gritty, grimy, and downright dangerous. The Victorian rat catchers were no knights in shining armor. They were more like knights in tarnished tin, armed with a ragtag arsenal and a questionable life expectancy. They weren't slaying dragons. They were wrestling with rodents, all while trying to dodge the deadly diseases that came with them. And yet, despite the filth, the danger, and the disdain, they persevered. Because at the end of the day, someone had to deal with the city's underbelly, and it wasn't going to be the folks sipping tea in their drawing rooms. So, the next time you hear the term rat race, spare a thought for those who raced against the rats in a very real sense. Their world was a far cry from any romanticized notions of Victorian life, but it was a world they navigated with a gritty determination that deserves our respect, even if it doesn't quite fit the mold of a storybook hero. As we continue to delve deeper into the life and times of these unsung urban warriors, remember that every rat catcher had a story, some tragic, some triumphant, but all woven into the complex tapestry of history. And as we move on to explore more about these formidable folks, keep in mind that the grit and grime of their lives were not just footnotes in the annals of history. They were the very foundation on which cities were built, one rat at a time. And so we march onward, deeper into the murky waters of Victorian economics, where rat catchers found themselves wading knee-deep in not just filth, but financial uncertainty. Welcome to the economy of the 19th century, where the divide between wealth and poverty was as vast as the river Thames itself. It's a tale not just of haves and have-nots, but of the barely getting bys, the scrappy survivors of the urban jungle who made a living in the shadow of the industrial behemoth. To understand why someone might voluntarily dive into a life of rat-catching, we need to peek into the wallet of a typical Victorian labourer. Picture this. An average working-class family in the 1850s pulling in around £50 a year if they were lucky. Now, that might sound princely until you realise that rent for a decent hovel could set you back £20 annually, leaving a paltry sum to cover food, clothing, and those little luxuries like, staying alive. Bread, your staple food, was about 9 pence for a loaf. Mutton, a shilling a pound. And don't even think about sugar, unless you fancied a luxury diet. The rat catcher, that intrepid soul, could expect to earn about 3 shillings per dozen rats. Sounds straightforward, but here's where it gets tricky. Rats don't exactly line up for the taking. It wasn't uncommon for catchers to spend entire nights prowling the bowels of the city, only to bring home enough rodents to barely fill a basket, and by extension, barely fill their bellies. In a week, a dedicated rat catcher might make between 10 to 15 shillings. Not exactly rolling in it, were they? Especially when you consider that by the time they've paid for their rudimentary gear, their trusty terrier, and perhaps a pint of gin to wash away the day's memories, they're left with cobwebs where their riches should be. Yet, it wasn't just about the money. There was a grim allure to the job, a sense of fierce independence in being your own boss, even if your staff consisted of a dog and a wooden club. For many, this was preferable to the factory grind, where workers toiled for similar wages, but with less autonomy and more repetition than a broken record. In the factories, you were just another cog in the machine, your life dictated by the relentless clanging of steam engines and overseers with all the charm of a hangover. So why risk it? Why plunge into the sewers when you could just as easily be manning a loom? Quite simply, it boiled down to necessity and the lack of better options. The Victorian era, for all its technological marvels, was a harsh mistress to those who couldn't afford a seat at the table of progress. The working class bore the brunt of industrialization's double-edged sword. More jobs, but also more competition and less security. The rat catchers were the daredevils of their day, balancing precariously on the tightrope of survival without a safety net in sight. But here's the kicker. The very disparity that made rat catching appealing also reinforced the economic structures that kept these workers tethered to their precarious existence. The wealthy, ensconced in their stately homes far from the stench of the slums, had little incentive to change a system that worked so well for them. The rat catchers, even as they played their part in upholding public health, were a stark reminder that the Industrial Revolution's bright lights cast long shadows. For the society of the time, rat catchers were a footnote in the grand narrative of progress, their struggles sidelined by tales of steam engines and railways. Yet, the broader impact of their labor can't be understated. By keeping the rat populations in check, they played a crucial role in preventing outbreaks of diseases that could have swept through the burgeoning cities like wildfire. They were inadvertent guardians of public health, often working behind the scenes in a grim pas-de-deux with the very vermin they sought to control. The economic landscape of the Victorian era was a tangled web of contradictions, where prosperity and poverty walked hand in hand. While the upper echelons of society basked in the glow of newfound wealth, the rat catchers toiled in the shadows, their lives a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity. They were the unsung foot soldiers in the battle against disease and decay, navigating a world that was as unyielding as the cobblestones underfoot. And so, as we continue this journey through the labyrinthine alleys of Victorian London, remember that every rat catcher was more than just a tradesperson. They were part of a complex socio-economic puzzle. Their struggles were a microcosm of the wider working-class experience, a reminder that even in the age of progress, the road to prosperity was often paved with hardship and grime. As we peel back the layers of history, we'll continue to uncover the stories of these tenacious individuals who made a living in the most unlikeliest of professions, driven by necessity and a dogged determination to carve out a place for themselves in a world that was as unforgiving as it was transformative. Because in the end, the story of the Victorian rat catcher is not just a tale of toil and tribulation. It's a testament to the indomitable will to survive against the odds, one rat at a time. The story of the Victorian rat catcher is a testament to resilience, grit, and a touch of madness. But as we delve into their legacy, it's important to recognize just how much they contributed to the evolution of public health and sanitation, even if they weren't exactly winning any popularity contests. These folks were the unsung heroes of their time, elbow-deep in the muck of urban expansion, paving the way for a healthier society, one rodent at a time. You see, the Victorian era was not just a period of industrial might and technological wonders. It was also a time when public health was about as organized as a toddler's crayon box. The infrastructure needed to support burgeoning populations was woefully inadequate, leaving cities like London in desperate need of reform. Enter the rat catchers, with their dubious tools and undeniable tenacity, who played an inadvertent but crucial role in highlighting the sanitation crisis. As rats scurried through the streets, bringing with them a cacophony of diseases, it became clear that something had to change. The presence of rat catchers underscored the pressing need for sanitation reform, a need that eventually caught the attention of reformers and policymakers. It was the mid-19th century when the momentum for change really began to build. The Great Stink of 1858, when the Thames was so rank that it forced Parliament to flee, was a pungent wake-up call. It didn't take a genius to connect the dots between the open sewers, rampant disease, and the rats that thrived in such conditions. There was a growing realization that if society wanted to rid itself of its uninvited guests, it needed to tackle the root cause, poor sanitation. This led to landmark developments like the construction of the London sewer system, designed by the engineer Joseph Bazalgette in the late 1850. Bazalgette's system was a masterpiece of civil engineering, a network of sewers that stretched over 100 miles, and finally provided a means to whisk away the city's waste. It was one of those rare instances where government action, spurred by public outcry, actually resulted in tangible improvements. The impact was immediate. Disease rates plummeted, and the rat population, deprived of its open buffet, began to decline. It was as if the city collectively sighed in relief, finally able to breathe without the stench of sewage clogging its lungs. But the legacy of the rat catchers isn't just one of sanitation reform. It's also about the changing perceptions of public health. The Victorian obsession with order and cleanliness gave rise to a new understanding of hygiene, one that recognized the importance of tackling the causes of disease rather than just its symptoms. This shift laid the groundwork for the broader public health movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which eventually led to the establishment of modern public health systems. While rat catchers may not have been the ones drawing up blueprints for sanitary reform, their day-to-day battles served as a grim reminder of what was at stake. And let's not forget the myths that have persisted about these rat-catching vigilantes. The romanticized view of them as fearless adventurers has a certain charm, but the reality was far grittier. They were men and women eking out a living in a world that cared little for their plight. Their story is a reminder of the harsh economic realities faced by the working class, who were often left to fend for themselves in the shadow of progress. Yet, there's a certain rugged nobility in their struggle, a testament to human perseverance when faced with overwhelming odds. In reflecting on the journey of the Victorian rat catcher, we see a narrative that goes beyond the grimy streets and scurrying rats. It's a story of societal awakening, of a time when the darkness of the alleys was matched by the flickering light of reform. The rat catchers, in their own way, were catalysts for change, their labor a stark reminder of the necessity for a healthier, more structured urban life. They were the canaries in the coal mine, sounding the alarm for a society on the brink of transformation. So, what lessons can modern society draw from this gritty chapter of history? For one, it underscores the importance of acknowledging and addressing the working conditions of those on the fringes, those who toil in the shadows of our cities. Their work, often unseen, is integral to the fabric of public health and safety. Secondly, it reminds us that progress doesn't come solely from innovation and industry, but from a willingness to confront the less glamorous aspects of urban life, like sewage and vermin. Lastly, it teaches us a timeless truth, that beneath every tale of grime and grit lies a story of survival, resilience, and the unyielding human spirit. As we conclude this exploration of the Victorian rat catcher, let's not just remember them as characters in a Dickensian drama, but as real people who navigated a world teetering on the edge of chaos. Their legacy is not just one of pest control, but of public health progress, a legacy that, while not celebrated with fanfare, is felt in the clean streets and healthier lives we enjoy today. So the next time you see a modern pest controller at work, spare a thought for their Victorian predecessors, who laid the groundwork for a healthier, more hygienic future, one rat at a time. Because if history teaches us anything, it's that sometimes the most unlikely heroes leave the deepest impact. In the rolling hills of what we now call Croatia, a storm was brewing, both literally and metaphorically. On July 10, 1856, as lightning crackled through the sky, Nikola Tesla made his dramatic entrance into the world amidst thunderclaps and a flash of brilliance, which, in hindsight, seems like a pretty fitting beginning for a man who would become an icon of electricity. But let's rewind a bit. Before Tesla was charming pigeons and dreaming up wireless electricity, he was just a kid with a knack for curiosity and a penchant for mischief. Born in the village of Smiljan, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Tesla was the fourth of 5 children. His father, Milutin Tesla, was an Orthodox priest and writer with a flair for drama, while his mother, Georgina, or Duca, was an inventive spirit in her own right, crafting household appliances long before it was cool. Tesla's early life was a cocktail of intellectual stimulation and pastoral simplicity. Books were his escape, and he devoured them like candy. By age 6, he'd already read Jules Verne and was tinkering with mechanical gizmos, much to the delight and occasional horror of his family. Now, let's not sugarcoat it. Tesla was a bit of an oddball, even by the standards of quirky geniuses. His brain was a whirling dervish of ideas, and he had the uncanny ability to visualize inventions in his mind with such clarity that he often skipped the whole drawing it out part. Just think of all the trees that could have been saved if more inventors were like him. School was a mixed bag for young Tesla. In 1870, he was shipped off to Karlstad, Croatia, for his higher education. Picture a lanky teenager with piercing eyes and an insatiable appetite for knowledge. He devoured subjects like a starving man at a buffet, with physics being his main course. But there was one incident that nearly snowballed, literally, into catastrophe. One winter, he was caught in a dramatic snowball fight, which escalated to the point where a giant snowball nearly flattened him. This near miss with death might have been a sign from the universe to focus his energy elsewhere. It's a good thing he did, or else the world might be a much dimmer place, literally and figuratively. Fast forward to his college years at the Polytechnic Institute in Graz, Austria. Tesla's academic record was nothing short of electric. He attended a staggering 9 lectures per day and aced every one of them. That's right, 9. If you're feeling proud about getting through double math in high school, Tesla just left you in the dust. The man was a study machine, but his passion for learning didn't necessarily translate to practical life skills. He was notorious for burning the midnight oil, often forgetting to eat or sleep, which led to a breakdown of sorts. The lesson here: even geniuses need to take a nap and grab a snack sometimes. However, it was at Graz that Tesla's obsession with electricity truly took hold. He became fascinated with alternating current, AC, a concept that would become the cornerstone of his career. But here's the kicker. Back then, the world was all about direct current, DC, thanks to Thomas Edison, the reigning king of electricity. DC was like the iPhone of its day, ubiquitous and seemingly untouchable. But Tesla, ever the rebel, saw potential in AC and began dreaming up ways to harness its power. In 1878, Tesla dropped out of Graz, much to the disappointment of his professors, who saw him as a rising star. He'd later enroll at Charles Ferdinand University in Prague, but fate had other plans. The untimely death of his father forced Tesla to abandon his studies and return home. Life had thrown a wrench in his plans, but Tesla was nothing if not resilient. By 1881, Tesla had found his way to Budapest, where he worked at the Central Telegraph Office. It was here that he had his first major breakthrough: the induction motor. Legend has it that the idea hit him like a bolt of lightning while he was strolling through a park reciting Goethe's Faust. Talk about a dramatic eureka moment. This invention would later become a critical component of the AC system, but at the time, it was just a figment of Tesla's imagination. Tesla's journey was about to take a transatlantic turn as he set his sights on the land of opportunity, America. It was the 1880, and the United States was a hotbed of innovation and industrial expansion. And waiting on the other side of the Atlantic was none other than Thomas Edison, a man whose name was synonymous with electricity. Tesla's move to the U.S. wasn't just a change of scenery. It was the start of an epic rivalry that would light up history, quite literally. So, as Tesla boarded a ship bound for New York in 1884, carrying little more than a few coins and a head full of revolutionary ideas, he was stepping into a new chapter of his life. Little did he know, this would be the beginning of a journey filled with triumphs, trials, and the kind of drama that would make for a pretty epic Netflix series. But that's a story for another time. For now, let's just savor the image of a young Nikola Tesla standing at the bow of a ship, staring out at the horizon with a glint of determination in his eye and a storm of genius brewing in his mind. As Tesla stood on the deck of that steamer headed for New York, you could almost hear the hum of destiny in the air. By 1884, immigrants like him were pouring into the United States, drawn by the magnetic pull of opportunity, or at least the promise of it. The country was a bustling playground of industrial ambition, and Tesla, ever the electrical wonderkind, was about to jump into the sandbox with Thomas Edison, the heavyweight champ of the wire and current game. So Tesla lands on American soil, and what does he find? A city that never sleeps, and perhaps because it's too busy buzzing with electricity, or at least trying to. The streets of Manhattan were alive with the flicker of electric lights, but underneath that bright surface, a storm was brewing. Enter Edison, the wizard of Menlo Park, who had already become a household name thanks to his improvements in the electric light bulb and the phonograph. Edison was all about direct current, DC, a system that was simpler but far less efficient for long distances. Think of it like sending a letter by snail mail when you could just shoot a text. Tesla, with his AC dreams, initially joined Edison's company with high hopes and a dash of naivete. Edison, ever the shrewd businessman, promised Tesla $50, 000, around $1. $4 million in today's money, if he could improve the efficiency of the DC generators. Spoiler alert, Tesla achieved the feat, but Edison, with a grin as charming as it was mischievous, backtracked, claiming the offer was just a joke. "Tesla, you don't understand American humor," Edison reportedly quipped. Ouch, talk about a shocking revelation. Slightly fried but unbroken, Tesla left Edison's employ, taking his AC dreams with him. Enter the war of currents, a clash of titans where the weapons of choice were wires, light bulbs, and a hefty dose of propaganda. Edison, adamant about DC, began a smear campaign against AC, painting it as dangerous and unpredictable. He even went so far as to stage public demonstrations where animals were electrocuted with AC to underscore the supposed danger. Yes, it was as gruesome as it sounds. And yes, it involved a very unfortunate elephant named Topsy. Sorry, Topsy, you deserved better. But why was Edison so bent on DC? Well, money and control, of course. DC systems required power stations every mile or so, meaning more infrastructure and more profit for those in control. AC, on the other hand, could travel long distances with minimal power loss, making it a cheaper and more efficient alternative. Was the classic tale of the old guard versus the innovator, a dance as old as time dressed in copper wires and electric sparks. Enter George Westinghouse, the industrial mogul who saw Tesla's genius and wasn't about to let it go to waste. In 1888, he bought Tesla's patents for AC motors and transformers for a cool $60, 000 in cash, plus $1 too, 50 per horsepower royalty. It was a pivotal moment, turning Tesla from a struggling inventor into a well-financed player in the electricity game. Westinghouse backed Tesla not just with words, but with cold, hard cash, a refreshing change from Edison's brand of humor. The stakes were high, tensions electric, and the media ate it all up. The war of currents wasn't just about volts and amps, it was about shaping the future. And while Edison was busy electrifying New York with his DC system, Tesla and Westinghouse were preparing to light up the 1893 Chicago World's Fair with AC power, a spectacle that would dazzle both the public and the skeptics. It was a showdown that would determine the direction of electrical transmission for generations to come. This wasn't just a battle of technology, it was a clash of ideologies. Edison, the quintessential businessman, saw technology as a means to control and profit, while Tesla, the idealistic visionary, saw it as a way to empower humanity. It was like watching a chess match where the pieces were life-sized and electrified. The air was charged with anticipation, and the world was watching. Tesla's vision of an AC-powered future was about to get its moment in the spotlight, and the world would never be the same. So buckle up, because the stage is set, the players are ready, and the lights are about to go on, literally. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the outcome would determine the very fabric of modern civilization. But that's a story we'll dive into next time. For now, let's leave our electrical gladiators poised for the next round, AC buzzing in the background, and the promise of a brighter future crackling in the air. As the curtain rose on the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, it was clear that this was not just any world fair. dubbed the Columbian Exposition. It was a celebration of the 400th anniversary of Columbus's voyage. Cue the ensuing debate about whether that's worth celebrating. But more importantly, it was a 600-acre playground of innovation and electricity, a battleground for the war of currents, with Tesla and Westinghouse poised to make Edison eat his DC-powered hat. Tesla, ever the showman, was in his element. Picture it. The fairgrounds were lit up like a Christmas tree on steroids, with 100,000 incandescent lamps powered by alternating current. It was a light show that made the 4th of July look like a candlelit dinner, and it dazzled the 27 million visitors who strolled through the exhibits. This was Tesla's moment to shine, literally and figuratively, and he did so with the kind of pizzazz that made even the most skeptical onlookers gasp. But let's pause and appreciate the sheer audacity of this feat. Back then, electricity was still a bit of a mystery to the average Joe. AC power, with its ability to travel long distances efficiently, was like science fiction come to life. Tesla and Westinghouse's winning bid to power the fair was $399,000, a hefty chunk of change back then, but a bargain for the spectacle they delivered. It was a triumph of technology and a big middle finger to Edison and his DC system. Yet, while Tesla was basking in the glow of his triumphs, he was also a man of peculiar habits and quirks. Take his love affair with pigeons, for instance. Tesla fed them, nursed them back to health, and even claimed to love one particular pigeon as a man loves a woman. Now, before you start imagining a Disney-style love story, know that Tesla was a man of celibacy and singular focus. He reserved his affections for the avian variety, declaring that the pigeon was his only true friend. There's something both charming and a little unsettling about a genius who found companionship in birds. Then there was his aversion to pearls. Yes, pearls. Tesla reportedly couldn't stand the sight of them and would refuse to speak to women wearing them. One can only wonder what traumatic pearl-related incident could have caused such a visceral reaction. Was it the way they glinted like tiny, taunting spheres, or did he simply have an irrational vendetta against mollusks? The world may never know, but it adds a delightful layer of eccentricity to his persona. Despite his brilliance lighting up Chicago and the world beyond, Tesla's story is not one of unblemished success. Financial woes seem to cling to him like a misaligned suit. After the fair's success, Tesla turned his attention to more ambitious projects, like wireless electricity transmission. But investors, ever the cautious creatures, were reluctant to throw money at ideas that seemed more like the fever dreams of a mad scientist than practical innovations. Nikola Tesla, for all his genius, was not a businessman. He held little interest in the mundane matters of finance and profit, which, as you can imagine, became a bit of a problem. Even after selling his AC patents, which should have set him up for life, Tesla managed to fritter away his fortune on wild experiments and ill-advised ventures. One such venture was the infamous Wardenclyffe Tower, an ambitious project to create a global wireless communication system. Spoiler, it didn't pan out, but let's not jump too far ahead. Back to the fair, where Tesla's AC power had clearly won the day. The victory was sweet, but it also painted a target on his back. Edison and his DC loyalists were none too pleased with the outcome. It was a classic case of the establishment feeling threatened by the upstart innovator. Edison's smear campaign against AC may have fizzled in the face of Tesla's success, but the Wizard of Menlo Park wasn't ready to concede defeat. The battle lines were drawn, and the war of currents would rage on in boardrooms and on city streets. Tesla's triumph in Chicago was a testament to his vision, but it also foreshadowed the struggles he would face in the years to come. Genius, after all, is not a free pass to financial stability or societal acceptance. Tesla's life is a cautionary tale about the perils of innovation in a world that values bottom lines over breakthroughs. Even as he illuminated the world, Tesla was haunted by the specter of financial ruin, a stark reminder that the glow of the spotlight can be as fleeting as a lightning bolt. So as the Chicago World's Fair faded into history, Tesla emerged as both a hero and a cautionary figure. His AC system would eventually power the world, but the man behind it would remain an enigma, a reminder that brilliance often comes with a side of eccentricity. As we leave Tesla basking in the afterglow of his victory, remember that this was just one chapter in a life filled with triumphs and tribulations. The lights may have dimmed for now, but the story of Nikola Tesla was far from over, and the world was still waiting to see what electric marvels he would conjure next. As the glow of the Chicago World's Fair slowly dimmed, Tesla's mind was already racing ahead, plotting a future where wires were obsolete and power flowed through the air like magic. Of course, to most people, this sounded as plausible as unicorns prancing through Central Park. But in Tesla's world, dreams were just ideas waiting to be zapped into reality. Enter Colorado Springs, 1899, a sleepy town soon to be jolted awake by Tesla's latest experiments. Imagine this, a lab perched on Pikes Peak's foothills, its roof topped with a 142-foot mast sparking with electricity. Tesla had come here to test his theories on transmitting power wirelessly, funded by an investor with deep pockets and a soft spot for mad scientist vibes. J. P. Morgan had thrown Tesla $150,000 to make the dream of wireless power a reality, a hefty sum, though not quite enough for the ambitious scope of Tesla's plans. But let's not kid ourselves. Tesla wasn't just thinking about powering a few light bulbs without wires. He was envisioning a world where information and energy danced freely through the ether. His lab became ground zero for experimentation, with Tesla creating artificial lightning bolts over 100 feet long. If you think your neighbor's DIY fireworks show is impressive, Tesla's were the kind that made the night sky crackle and the local wildlife run for cover. However, Tesla's electrifying antics didn't sit well with everyone. His experiments frequently resulted in power outages across Colorado Springs. Imagine the townsfolk, mid-toast or mid-shave, suddenly plunged into darkness as Tesla's lab sucked up enough power to fry an entire grid. It's like stealing Wi-Fi from the entire neighborhood, except instead of Netflix buffering, you've got lights flickering off across the whole town. While Tesla was busy turning the Colorado sky into his personal light show, he found an unlikely ally in Mark Twain. Yes, that Mark Twain, the one with the bushy mustache and penchant for wit. Twain was a frequent visitor to Tesla's New York lab, where the two shared a mutual admiration society. Twain, who was as curious about technology as Tesla was about literature, once claimed that Tesla's oscillating machine had cured his chronic constipation. Though let's chalk that up to the placebo effect, shall we? Their friendship was an odd but fitting match. Twain, the literary giant, and Tesla, the electric wizard, both understood the power of storytelling. Tesla provided Twain with scientific fodder for his imagination, while Twain offered Tesla a glimpse into the human psyche. If only social media had existed back then, imagine the tweets. Today, at Nikola, Tesla made my mustache stand on end, Twain might have posted. Electrifying experience. But back to those 100-foot lightning bolts. Tesla believed he was on the verge of a breakthrough. The idea was to send electricity through the Earth itself, tapping into the planet's natural resonance to transmit power wirelessly. It sounds like a plot ripped from a sci-fi novel, but Tesla was convinced it was possible. He even claimed to have picked up extraterrestrial signals, though modern scientists suspect he was probably just hearing natural radio waves. But hey, who are we to crush the dreams of an electrical pioneer? Tesla's time in Colorado wasn't just spent chasing lightning and chatting up literary legends. He was also tinkering with a device he called the Death Ray. Now, before you imagine Tesla as a supervillain with a penchant for world domination, let's clarify. Tesla saw this invention as a peacekeeper, not a destroyer. The idea was to develop a weapon so powerful that it would deter war entirely. But like many of Tesla's projects, it was never fully realized. The Death Ray remained a tantalizing what-if, relegated to the annals of speculative fiction. Meanwhile, back in the real world, Tesla's financial backers were getting jittery. The Colorado Springs experiments were costly, and while Tesla had proven he could light up the sky, he hadn't exactly demonstrated a practical application that would make investors drool. J. P. Morgan, in particular, was growing impatient. He had his eyes on profits, not pyrotechnics, and Tesla's grand visions were beginning to look like expensive pipe dreams. Tesla returned to New York in 1900. His Colorado lab shuddered, and his ambitions for wireless power still unrealized. He poured his remaining resources into Wardenclyffe Tower, a grand project on Long Island that promised to fulfill his vision of global wireless communication. But again, the financial fates were not in his favor. Despite its imposing presence, Wardenclyffe was more of a monument to Tesla's ambition than a harbinger of technological revolution. By 1917, Wardenclyffe stood unfinished, a testament to both Tesla's visionary genius and his impracticality. The tower was demolished, its copper sold for scrap, as Tesla's financial troubles deepened. It was a harsh reality check for a man who had once been hailed as the future of electricity. Yet, even as his personal fortunes dwindled, Tesla's ideas continued to ripple through the world. So, as Tesla's later years approached, he found himself more of a legend than a luminary, a man out of time, whose ideas often outpaced the technology needed to realize them. He remained a figure of fascination, a lonely genius whose dreams of wireless power and peacemaking death rays were both visionary and tragically ahead of their time. And there, in the twilight of his career, we leave Tesla surrounded by pigeons, shadows, and the lingering spark of brilliance that had once set the world alight. As the story of his later years unfolds, we'll delve deeper into the myths and truths that define this extraordinary man. Stay tuned, because the legend of Nikola Tesla is far from over, and the next chapter is just waiting to be written in the electric hum of history. And so, as the last years of Nikola Tesla's life unfolded, they resembled less a grand finale and more a poignant coda. By the 1930s, the man who had once electrified the world with his brilliance and eccentricity found himself dimmed by the harsh realities of age and obscurity. Tesla had moved into the New Yorker Hotel, an Art Deco behemoth in Manhattan, where the electric hum of the city outside served as a bittersweet reminder of his glory days. There, in room 3327, he lived out his final years, not as the celebrated inventor of myth, but as a solitary figure, more a ghost of his former self than a man in full. Let's get one thing straight. Tesla was not your typical retiree in a cardigan with a penchant for gardening. Even in his twilight years, his mind was a live wire, crackling with ideas that the world was not yet ready to handle. He spent his days feeding pigeons in Bryant Park, reportedly claiming that he loved a particular white pigeon as one might love a human. Whether this was true love or a metaphor for the isolation he felt, we can only speculate. But it's a testament to Tesla's enduring quirkiness that he found solace among feathered creatures, while the world around him bustled with the very technology he helped create. Despite his financial woes, Tesla never stopped dreaming big. He continued to devise plans for inventions that seemed to defy the laws of physics, like a teleforce weapon, dubbed the Peace Ray, which he claimed could bring an end to war by making armed conflict obsolete. While the concept was as fantastical as a James Bond gadget, Tesla was convinced it was the key to world peace. Unfortunately, his attempts to secure funding for such projects were met with skepticism. Investors were more interested in the tangible gains from electrifying their profits than in bankrolling what they saw as the ramblings of an aging visionary. Tesla's financial situation was as precarious as a house of cards in a windstorm. Despite his monumental contributions to the modern world, he died virtually penniless on January 7, 1943, at the age of 86. The man who had revolutionized the way we think about electricity ended his days in debt, a victim of both his own impracticality and a world that failed to recognize his genius until it was too late. It's a sobering reminder that being ahead of your time is not always a ticket to prosperity. Sometimes it's just a lonely road less traveled. Now, let's talk legacy. Today, Tesla's name is synonymous with innovation, thanks in no small part to Elon Musk's electric car company, Tesla, Inc., which has helped catapult the inventor back into the public consciousness. But in Tesla's own time, his contributions were often overshadowed by more commercially savvy contemporaries. The man who envisioned a world connected by wireless energy and communication was instead relegated to the footnotes of history books. It raises the question, why did it take so long for the world to catch up with Tesla's vision? The answer is as complex as Tesla himself. Part of it lies in the nature of the innovations he pursued. Tesla wasn't content with incremental improvements. He aimed for the stars, literally in some cases. His ideas were so far-reaching that they often outstripped the technological capabilities of his era. Wireless energy, for example, was a concept that wouldn't find practical application until the late 20th and early 21st centuries. when advancements in technology finally began to catch up with Tesla's imagination. Moreover, Tesla was a man who lived in the clouds, often detached from the gritty realities of business and finance. He was more interested in the purity of invention than in the pragmatic concerns of making a buck. This idealism, while admirable, left him vulnerable to exploitation by more ruthless figures. Edison, for example, was a master of the business side of innovation, whereas Tesla was more of a pure scientist, uninterested in the bottom line. It's the classic tale of the dreamer and the dealer, where one envisions a brighter future and the other knows how to sell it. In the end, Tesla's legacy is a paradox, a man whose ideas were too big for the world he lived in, yet whose influence is palpably felt in the technology that shapes our everyday lives. From the alternating current that powers our homes to the wireless communication that connects us across continents, Tesla's innovations are the bedrock of modern civilization. Even his more outlandish dreams, like wireless energy transmission, are slowly becoming realities, as researchers continue to build on the foundations he laid. So as we reflect on Tesla's life, let's take a moment to appreciate both the romance and the reality. The romance of a man who saw the world not as it was, but as it could be. And the reality that genius, while awe-inspiring, does not always come with a happy ending or a healthy bank balance. Tesla was a pioneer, a visionary, and yes, a bit of an oddball. But he was also a man who dared to dream beyond the confines of his time, leaving behind a legacy that continues to illuminate our path forward. As you switch off this little dive into history and perhaps dim the lights for the night, spare a thought for Nikola Tesla, a man who lit up the world with his imagination and whose legacy continues to burn bright, even if his personal story concluded in shadows. The world has finally caught up with Tesla, and as we move into an era of unprecedented technological advancement, it feels like he's right there with us, whispering through the electric hum, "The future is yours to create." In the swirling mists of ancient history, where fact and folklore dance an awkward tango, the Druids emerge as the enigmatic life of the party types who might just have been the original multi-hyphenates. These Celtic all-stars, dating back to around 1200 BCE, were the ultimate overachievers, juggling roles as priests, judges, and scholars like they were auditioning for an ancient talent show. But don't let the Hollywood version fool you. This wasn't all robes and mystical chants under the moonlit sky. We're diving into the nitty-gritty of who these Druids really were, sans the romanticized smoke and mirrors. Now, let's start with the Celts, the cultural mothership from which the Druids descended. The Celts were a robust bunch, thriving across what we now call Europe. Think France, Germany, and the British Isles, plus a bit of a jaunt into Iberia. Around 1200 BCE, they were the avengers of the ancient world, minus the capes, but with a penchant for iron. Their society was as layered as a mill fuel, with warriors, craftspeople, and the elite class of Druids at the top of the pastry. And yes, it's easy to picture them as a bunch of forest-dwelling sages, but the Druids were more like the ancient Swiss army knife, versatile, indispensable, and a little sharp to handle. If you're wondering how they became the societal heavyweights, look no further than their role as intermediaries between the gods and the people. Druids were priests by day, leading rituals, interpreting omens, and ensuring nobody angered a deity over breakfast. They had a heartline to the spiritual world, which made them indispensable, especially when your crops were failing, or your cattle had mysteriously decided to stage a walkout. But these guys weren't just about the afterlife. Oh no, they were also the ancient world's answer to Judge Judy. Disputes, they settled them. Laws, they quite literally laid down the law. And when they weren't busy being the original fact-checkers of the natural world, they were scholars, preserving knowledge and educating the next generation. In essence, being a druid was like having the job description of a small village rolled into one person. Now, before you go picturing them as the mysterious figures of legend, let's tap into some primary sources to ground this in reality. Enter Julius Caesar, the man who wrote more about the Druids than anyone else, mostly because he was busy conquering Gaul and had a front-row seat to their antics. In his Commentarii de Bello Gallico, he described them as a powerful social class, exempt from taxes and military service. Nice gig if you can get it right. Caesar was genuinely impressed, or maybe just a little terrified, by their influence. He noted that they taught about the stars, the universe, and even the immortality of the soul, which sounds suspiciously like the curriculum of a particularly intense liberal arts college. And then there's Pliny the Elder, a Roman author who never met a fact he couldn't embellish. Pliny's take on the Druids is a cocktail of curiosity and hyperbole. He was fascinated by their use of mistletoe in rituals, waxing poetic about their reverence for this plant like it was the key to a cosmic mystery. But let's be clear, Pliny didn't hold back on the drama, describing Druidic ceremonies in ways that would make any soap opera proud. The Druids' supposed mystery is largely the result of Roman writers who, lacking the convenience of Google Translate, relied on observation and a bit of creative license, were outsiders looking in. And as any good historian will tell you, a mix of admiration and fear can turn any cultural practice into something that seems otherworldly. The truth is, Druids were masterful at navigating the complex web of Celtic society, and their practices, though steeped in ritual, were grounded in the everyday realities of their communities. So, while the myth of the Druid as a shadowy figure whispering incantations in sacred groves is undeniably compelling, the historical reality is both more mundane and infinitely more interesting. They were the glue that held their society together, the keepers of knowledge and the arbiters of justice. And sure, they might have thrown a few epic parties in the forest, but at the end of the day, the Druids were as much about social order and education as they were about mysticism. As we peel back the layers of myth, we find not just the echoes of ancient chants, but the very real voices of leaders who helped shape the world of the Celts. While our modern imagination might conjure Druids as the Hogwarts professors of the ancient world, their real curriculum involved more than just waving wands and reciting spells. Let's reframe the scene. These folks were conducting ceremonies that were far more grounded in reality than the misty allure suggests. Rituals, after all, are like ancient Instagram stories, moments of significance shared with a community, though likely without the filter. First up, let's tackle the infamous oak groves, essentially the Druids' version of a church, if your church was an outdoor venue with a strict dress code of robes and solemnity. The oak was the VIP tree of the Celtic world, a natural skyscraper that reached towards the heavens, and more importantly, housed sacred mistletoe. Why such reverence for mistletoe? Blame Pliny the Elder again, who described the Druids harvesting it with golden sickles, which sounds positively cinematic. In reality, the focus on these sacred groves likely served as a reminder of nature's centrality to Celtic life. Picture a society so intertwined with nature that cutting down an oak was like demolishing a cathedral. It was spiritual environmentalism before Greta Thunberg made it cool. Now, let's address the thornier issue of human sacrifice. Cue dramatic music and insert Roman propaganda. The Romans, ever the drama queens, painted the Druids as bloodthirsty killers who couldn't get through a ritual without offering up a few human lives. But hang on, this narrative might not be as cut and dried as a Caesar salad. Sure, there are accounts suggesting that, in times of dire need, a life might be exchanged to appease the gods. But the frequency and scale, likely exaggerated by Romans who were justifying their conquest by painting the Celts as barbaric. After all, nothing like a bit of creative license to rally your troops against the savages. Archaeological evidence doesn't exactly back up the Roman horror stories, suggesting that human sacrifice was rare, not a daily event with a sign-up sheet. In truth, Druidic rituals often revolved around the cycles of nature, solstices, equinoxes, and harvests, original reasons to party. These events were less about bloodshed and more about ensuring survival. When your entire society hinges on the whims of weather and crop yields, a little divine intervention can't hurt, right? Picture a community gathered under the stars, chanting not out of superstition, but necessity, a collective hope to sway the forces of nature in their favor. It's a far cry from the Hollywood version of Druids as sinister, hooded figures lurking in the shadows. So why did these myths persist? Well, stories tend to grow legs, especially when they are repeated by historians with a flair for the dramatic. And let's face it, the Romans weren't exactly unbiased sources. Their accounts served to justify conquest by painting the Celts as their other, a classic case of history being written by the victors. But the reality was far more nuanced. The Druids weren't just enacting rituals for the sake of spectacle. They were reinforcing the community's bond with the land and each other. It was practical, not just mystical, a pre-modern TED talk on sustainability and social cohesion. As we peel back the layers of myth, we find that the Druids' practices were deeply embedded in the socio-economic fabric of Celtic life. The rituals provided a framework for understanding the world in an era before science could explain the unexplainable. This wasn't just about nature worship. It was about survival tactics dressed up in ceremonial garb. Forget the idea of Druids as mere mystics. Think of them as early environmentalists, cultural custodians, and the arbiters of a society that lived on the knife edge of nature's whims. The oak groves and mistletoe, the rituals and rare sacrifices, they all speak to a society striving to understand its place in the universe. The Druids were the bridge between the mundane and the divine, their ceremonies a testament to the human need for connection and meaning. Sure, the Romans spun tales that made for great campfire stories, but the truth, it's a saga of a people deeply connected to their world, trying to navigate the chaos of life with a little help from their sacred friends. So, next time you picture a Druid, imagine less Gandalf and more earthy philosopher-priest, crafting a community survival guide with every ritual performed. As we continue this journey through the ancient Celtic world, let's dig deeper into the socio-political clout the Druids wielded, like ancient political consultants, only without PowerPoint presentations. These weren't just forest philosophers lounging under oaks. They were the glue holding Celtic tribes together, the intellectual powerhouses who could make or break tribal dynamics. First up, let's talk about their role as educators. Forget the image of a stuffy classroom with desks and chalkboards. Druidic education was more like a never-ending seminar in an outdoor amphitheater. They trained the next generation in oral tradition, which was the Celtic version of Google Drive, minus the cloud storage, but with a lot more memory work. And let's be honest, memorizing up to 20 years worth of lore, and history, that's like cramming your entire school career into a single brain. But for the Druids, this was essential. They were the living libraries, the custodians of knowledge in a world with no written word. It was a system based on trust and respect, where the spoken word was as binding as any written contract today. Now, onto their role in law and governance. Picture the Celtic tribes with their chieftains and warriors, a society that valued strength and loyalty, but who settled disputes when two clans decided to squabble over pastures or pilfered cattle. Enter the Druids, the ultimate mediators. They were the original Judge Judy, delivering verdicts that were respected and, importantly, understood by all. The Druids' judgments were based on precedent, a bit like common law, but with a hint of divine inspiration. And their decisions weren't just binding, they were almost sacred, which is an impressive feat when you consider they didn't have the luxury of writing things down for posterity. The Druids' influence extended beyond the courtroom. In a world where the divine was interwoven with the mundane, their spiritual guidance helped maintain social order. They were the moral compass of the tribe, ensuring that laws were not only followed, but that they were in harmony with the natural and spiritual world. And let's not forget their ability to convene assemblies where tribal leaders could hash out alliances or resolve conflicts. It was like the United Nations, but with more facial hair and fewer translators. Economically speaking, the Druids were also instrumental. Their festivals weren't just about feasting and fireside tales. They were economic powerhouses. Events like Samhain and Beltane were the Celtic version of Black Friday, a time for trade and barter that brought together craftsmen, traders, and farmers. These gatherings were opportunities for economic exchange, where goods, livestock, and ideas flowed as freely as the mead. The Druids, with their deep connection to both the divine and the temporal, were central to these events, ensuring that the rituals performed were not just spiritual affairs, but also economically beneficial. They understood that a well-timed blessing or a favorable omen could grease the wheels of commerce. So, how did they maintain such influence without a written language? It's a bit like asking how Netflix survives without a cable network. The answer lies in adaptability and oral tradition. The Druids' teachings were like a verbal blockchain, secure, decentralized, and trusted. By embedding their knowledge in songs, stories, and rituals, they ensured that it was passed down accurately. This oral tradition was an art form, requiring precision and skill, a bit like being a human podcast without the rewind button. And let's not underestimate the power of mystique. The Druids' refusal to write things down only added to their enigmatic aura. It was like having the ultimate secret recipe that everyone wanted, but no one could quite replicate. Their knowledge was exclusive, a private club of sorts that you could only join through years of dedication and training. This exclusivity ensured that their influence remained unchallenged, their authority unquestioned. In the grand tapestry of Celtic society, the Druids were the threads that kept everything together. They were the educators, the judges, the spiritual guides, and the economic enablers. Their power didn't come from swords or armies, but from the knowledge they wielded and the respect they commanded. The Druids were the silent architects of a society that thrived in the chaotic dance between the natural and the supernatural. As we peel back the layers, we find a society where the Druids' influence was as much about practicality as it was about mysticism. They were the ultimate pragmatists, understanding that to hold power, one must be indispensable, and they were, in every sense of the word. Their legacy is one of subtle yet profound influence, a testament to the power of knowledge over brute force. So, as we continue to unravel the mysteries of the Druids, remember that beneath the layers of myth and legend lies a story of astute political maneuvering and economic savvy. The Druids weren't just mystical figures lost in the mists of time. They were the very real architects of their world, crafting a society that balanced on the knife edge of nature's whims and human ambition. And as we move forward, let's delve even deeper into how these enigmatic figures navigated the complexities of ancient Celtic life, shaping a society that would leave an indelible mark on history. As we turn the page on the Druids' heyday, let's roll out the Roman red carpet, or maybe the bloody battlefield carpet, because the Roman conquest of Gaul in 50 BCE was less of a welcome party and more of a cultural steamroller. Picture this: Julius Caesar, the ultimate multitasker with a penchant for empire building, striding into Gaul with legions behind him, ready to expand Rome's borders and fill its coffers. The Druids, with their oaken rituals and oral traditions, suddenly found themselves face to face with a society that not only spoke Latin, but also carried a big stick and wasn't afraid to use it. The Romans, ever the pragmatic conquerors, were less interested in the Druids' mystical mumbo-jumbo and more in securing resources, taxing the populace, and establishing law and order, Roman style, of course. And by law and order, I mean imposing Roman law and squashing anything that remotely smacked of rebellion or independence. The Druids, with their significant social influence and power over the Celtic tribes, were seen as a threat to this new regime. After all, who needs competing power structures when you're trying to build an empire? Roman military might was nothing if not thorough. They dismantled the Druidic centers, the sacred groves that had been the heart of Celtic spirituality. These oak-filled sanctuaries, once the backdrop for rituals and gatherings, became prime targets, chopped down faster than you can say timber in Latin. Without their sacred spaces, the Druids lost not just physical ground, but spiritual authority. It was a strategic play by the Romans: eliminate the temples, and you cut off the religious head of the snake. And then there was Roman law, as rigid as a centurion's helmet. The Druids, who'd been laying down the law like ancient Judge Judys, suddenly had their authority usurped by Roman magistrates. Roman law was written, codified, and enforced with military precision. Forget about oral tradition. If it wasn't on parchment, it didn't count. The Druids' power, derived from their role as legal and spiritual arbitrators, evaporated faster than a puddle in the Sahara. Economically, the Romans were no slouches either. They introduced new trade routes, minted coins, and established markets, effectively integrating Gaul into the wider Roman economy. The Druids, who had once presided over local trade and festivals, found themselves sidelined. Roman festivals and guards were imported, complete with their own set of rituals and ceremonies, edging out the old Celtic ways. The economic power of the Druids, tied to their control over trade and agriculture, dwindled as Roman influence grew. But the Romans weren't just about brute force and bureaucracy. They had a softer weapon in their arsenal: cultural assimilation. They offered the Celts a slice of the Roman pie: citizenship, infrastructure, and the Pax Romana. It was a tempting offer, especially when the alternative was, well, Roman legions knocking at your door. The allure of Roman roads, baths, and aqueducts, concrete symbols of civilization, was hard to resist. And slowly but surely, the Celtic tribes began to adopt Roman ways, leaving Druidic practices by the wayside. And then came Christianity, the proverbial nail in the Druidic coffin. By the time of Constantine in the early 4th century CE, Christianity was on the rise, spreading through the Roman Empire with the zeal of a new convert. Unlike the Druids, who preferred the shadows of groves, Christians met in plain sight, building churches and gathering followers. Their message of salvation and eternal life had a mass appeal that Druidic mysticism couldn't match. The Druids' complex rituals and oral teachings paled in comparison to the straightforward, written word of the Gospels. The political and economic shifts brought by Rome set the stage for Christianity's ascendancy. The Druids, who once held sway over the spiritual and legal realms, were now outflanked by a religion that offered not just spiritual fulfillment, but also social and political advancement. Christianity's rise was less about swords and more about souls, but it was no less effective in changing the cultural landscape. In the end, the decline of Druidism wasn't a dramatic fall from grace, but a slow fading into the background. The Druids, who had once been indispensable to Celtic life, found themselves antiquated relics in a world that had moved on. The Roman conquest and the rise of Christianity didn't just topple a religion, they transformed an entire society. The Druids, once the arbiters of law and keepers of knowledge, became footnotes in history, replaced by Roman laws and Christian doctrines. Yet the legend of the Druids persisted, shrouded in the mists of history, romanticized by later generations who yearned for a connection to a mystical past. The reality, though, was far more complex, a tale of cultural shifts, economic realities, and the relentless march of empire. The Druids may have vanished as a social class, but their legacy lingers, a reminder of a time when spirituality and society were inextricably linked, and the natural world was not just a backdrop, but a central player in the drama of human life. As we prepare to dive even deeper into the story of the Druids, let's keep unraveling this tapestry of history, where myths meet reality, and the echoes of ancient chants still linger in the air. The decline of Druidism is just one chapter in a broader saga of transformation, a tale as old as time itself. As we delve into the final chapter of our Druidic tale, let's take a moment to reflect on how the modern world has painted its own portrait of these ancient figures. Spoiler alert, it's often more J.K. Rowling than Julius Caesar. Today, Druids have been resurrected in New Age circles, depicted as mystical environmentalists with a penchant for peace and harmony that would make even Woodstock look tame. And while that's a lovely thought, it's about as historically accurate as a Renaissance fair. You see, the New Age movement has embraced Druids as symbols of nature worship and ancient wisdom, conveniently sidestepping the gritty realities of their socio-political roles. In this version, Druids are like spiritual life coaches, offering eco-friendly advice and channeling energies that sound suspiciously like a wellness retreat itinerary. But the truth is, while the Druids were indeed deeply connected to nature, they weren't exactly hugging every tree they saw. Their relationship with the natural world was less about spiritual enlightenment and more about survival tactics. It's one thing to hold hands in a circle under the stars. It's another to ensure your tribe doesn't starve come winter. Pop culture hasn't done much to clarify things either. From TV shows to novels, Druids are often portrayed as magical beings capable of feats that would make any Marvel superhero green with envy. Spells, shapeshifting, and secret knowledge. Sounds thrilling on screen, but historically, Druids wielded power through oratory and knowledge, not magic wands. They were the original influencers, shaping opinions and guiding decisions with words, not wizardry. Now, let's talk about the real legacy of Druidic practices, the ones you're more likely to find at a modern-day Celtic festival than in a fantasy film. Take Samhain, for example. This ancient festival, marking the end of the harvest season, has evolved into what we now know as Halloween. The original Samhain was a time when the veil between worlds was believed to be thin, a chance to commune with the spirits and honor the dead. Today, it's less about appeasing spectral visitors and more about candy and costumes. But beneath the commercial trappings, the echoes of Druidic rituals remain, a testament to the enduring power of tradition, even when it's draped in plastic spider webs. Similarly, Beltane, the festival of fire and fertility, is celebrated in various forms across the Celtic world. While modern celebrations might feature maypoles and Morris dancing, the essence of Beltane, celebrating the return of life and warmth, is a direct line to Druidic practices. It's a reminder of the cyclical nature of life and the importance of community coming together to mark the turning of the seasons. These festivals, stripped of their original socio-political weight, still carry the legacy of Druidic influence, albeit in a form that's more about communal joy than cosmic significance. But why do these romanticized myths and modern interpretations persist? Partly, it's the allure of the unknown. Druids, shrouded in mystery and lacking a written record, invite speculation. After all, who doesn't love a good mystery? Add to that the human penchant for nostalgia, the desire to connect with a past that feels simpler, purer, more harmonious, and you've got the perfect recipe for myth-making. The Druids, with their enigmatic aura, become the ideal canvas onto which we project our hopes, fears, and fantasies. Yet, it's essential to remember that behind the myth was a complex reality. Druids, as we've seen, were integral to Celtic society, wielding influence that was as much about political acumen as spiritual insight. Their legacy is not just in the festivals that endure, but in the reminder that knowledge, whether oral or written, holds power. They navigated a world on the brink of change, adapting and influencing in ways that ensured their survival, even as the Romans and later Christianity sought to erase their ways. In wrapping up this journey through the ancient world of the Druids, it's clear their story is one of resilience and adaptation. They were more than just mystical figures. They were leaders, educators, and strategists who understood the ebb and flow of human societies. Their practices, though often romanticized, offer a profound insight into the human condition, a reminder that even in a world dominated by the tangible, the intangible remains a powerful force. So, the next time you find yourself at a Celtic festival or caught in the enchantment of a Druid-inspired narrative, remember the layers of history beneath the surface. Behind the myths and the modern interpretations lies a story of a people who, like us, sought to understand their world and find their place within it. It's a tale as old as time, one that continues to resonate because it speaks to the enduring human quest for meaning and connection. And as we close the book on the Druids, let's carry their legacy forward, not as relics of a forgotten past, but as reminders of the complex tapestry of history that shapes us all. In the bustling streets of ancient Thebes, where the scent of incense mingled with the dusty air and the sound of traders bargaining formed an ever-present soundtrack, a curious event was unfolding. This was not the typical coronation fanfare where a new pharaoh would step into his role with the usual pomp. No, Akhenaten, the man of the hour, had a different vision. He wasn't just looking to wear the crown. He was looking to upend the entire theological apple cart. So here we are in 1353 BC, where Akhenaten, formerly known as Amenhotep IV, decided that Egypt's pantheon of gods was just a bit too crowded for his liking. Imagine a cosmic game of musical chairs where only one deity gets a seat. That's right, out with the old and in with the Aten, the sun disk. It was an ambitious, some might say reckless, move to shift from the polytheism that had been the backbone of Egyptian culture for centuries to a monotheistic belief system. It's like trying to convince your devoutly Catholic grandmother to give up the saints and stick with just one holy figure. Good luck with that. But let's not sugarcoat it. Akhenaten's religious shake-up wasn't just a spiritual journey. It was a political power play with economic strings attached. By declaring Aten as the sole god, Akhenaten didn't just make a spiritual statement. He effectively centralized religious power under his own roof. Priests who had wielded significant influence over the masses and the treasury suddenly found themselves out of the loop. And let's be honest, nobody likes to be suddenly benched from the game without a say. Now, what's a pharaoh to do when he wants to make a clean break with the past? Build a new city, of course. Akhenaten didn't just stop at changing religious practices. He went full throttle and decided to construct an entire new capital dedicated to Aten. Enter Akhenaten, modern-day Amarna, the city built from scratch in the middle of the desert. While the old-timers in Thebes were probably rolling their eyes, Akhenaten forged ahead with a new urban center that was as revolutionary as his religious reforms. The construction of Akhenaten was no small feat. Picture this, a sprawling city with temples, palaces, and houses for the elite, all springing up like mushrooms after a rain, except these mushrooms were made of stone and required back-breaking labor. Thousands of workers were brought in to turn this vision into reality. This was no weekend DIY project. It was a massive investment of resources and manpower. The economic implications were as vast as the desert sands surrounding the city. Akhenaten's gamble wasn't just theological, it was financial. But let's talk about the price tag. Moving the capital wasn't just a matter of packing a few boxes and loading them onto donkey carts. It required a serious commitment of resources. Estimates suggest the labor force numbered in the tens of thousands, with construction stretching over a decade. That's a lot of bread and beer, the staples of the Egyptian diet, to keep the workers fueled, not to mention the cost of materials and logistics. The economic strain was immense, putting pressure on an already stretched treasury. Politically, Akhenaten's reforms didn't win him any popularity contests, either. He was essentially telling the powerful priesthood of Ammon, "Thanks, but no thanks. Your services are no longer needed." These were the same priests who had enjoyed centuries of wealth and influence, and they were about as happy with this development as a cat in a bathtub. Their support evaporated faster than morning dew in the Egyptian sun, leaving Akhenaten isolated in his new city, surrounded by his loyalists and the Aten-worshipping elite. It's easy to romanticize Akhenaten as a visionary, a religious pioneer ahead of his time. But the reality check is that his reforms were disruptive, destabilizing, and downright dangerous. The economic and political upheavals were felt across the kingdom, leaving a legacy that was as controversial as it was transformative. As Akhenaten gazed upon his sunlit city, he might have felt like the master of his own revolutionary universe. Yet, beneath the gleaming surface of his new capital, the foundations of Egyptian society were cracking under the strain of his bold experiment. The story of Akhenaten is far from over, and as we delve deeper into his reign, the complexities of his religious revolution will continue to unfold. Would Akhenaten's daring gamble pay off, or would it lead to his downfall? Only time and history would tell. As the sun set on Akhenaten, casting long shadows across the freshly carved stone, the cracks in Akhenaten's grand vision were becoming more apparent than ever. His religious revolution, while artistically ambitious, was economically contentious. Closure of temples dedicated to the old gods, particularly the wealth-laden sanctuaries of Ammon, was like pulling the rug out from under the feet of Egypt's economy. These temples weren't just spiritual hubs, they were economic powerhouses. Picture them as ancient Egyptian wall streets where wealth, influence, and trade converged. By shutting them down, Akhenaten wasn't just making a theological statement. He was poking a hornet's nest of financial chaos. For centuries, the priestly class had enjoyed a sweet gig. They controlled vast amounts of land, collected taxes, and had a financial grip on the kingdom that would make modern-day lobbyists green with envy. With Akhenaten's decree, their coffers were suddenly looking as empty as a pharaoh's tomb after the grave robbers had been through. The economic ripple effect was seismic, trade networks disrupted, jobs lost, and local economies in freefall. Talk about a divine upheaval. Enter Nefertiti, the queen who wasn't just standing in her husband's shadow. Think of her as the Cleopatra before Cleopatra, a political and cultural powerhouse in her own right. If Akhenaten was the face of this religious revolution, Nefertiti was the brains behind the operation. Together, they were the original power couple, dazzling and controversial. Their partnership is often painted with the romantic brushstrokes of a fairy tale, but the reality was more akin to a high-stakes Game of Thrones. They ruled side by side, depicted in art as equal partners, which in itself was revolutionary. Nefertiti's influence extended beyond the domestic sphere, and she played a crucial role in promoting the Aten cult. Some scholars even suggest she was co-regent, wielding power in her own right. While they might have been the poster couple for Atenism, the practical challenges of their reign were anything but glamorous. Moving an entire capital city wasn't just a bold statement, it was a logistical nightmare. Imagine the ancient Egyptian equivalent of relocating New York City to the Nevada desert, complete with all the political and social headaches that would entail. The social unrest was palpable, with people uprooting their lives and livelihoods to follow the pharaoh's grand plan. Not everyone was thrilled about swapping the bustling life of Thebes for a dusty, unfinished metropolis. The strain on resources was immense. Akhenaten's vision required not just manpower, but a constant supply of food, water, and materials to sustain the capital's burgeoning population. The economic strain from these demands only exacerbated the financial turmoil caused by the temple closures. It was a classic case of biting off more than one could chew, and the kingdom's coffers were feeling the pinch. The social fabric of Egypt was fraying at the edges, with murmurs of dissent echoing through the corridors of power. Akhenaten might have been basking in the Aten's glow, but there was a storm brewing on the horizon. The construction of Akhenaten, while impressive, was also a testament to the sheer audacity of Akhenaten's rule. The city stretched over 8 miles along the Nile's east bank, with grand temples and lavish palaces that were intended to reflect the glory of the Aten. Yet, beneath the surface of this architectural marvel lay the discontent of a populace grappling with change. The workers who toiled under the relentless sun were not just building a city, they were constructing a monument to the pharaoh's hubris. As Akhenaten and Nefertiti presided over their new capital, the cracks in their utopian vision began to widen. The priesthood, once the backbone of Egyptian society, was seething with resentment. Their power stripped, they became centers of intrigue and opposition. Akhenaten's reforms might have seemed like a divine mandate, but they were also a political gamble of epic proportions. The question remained: could a king who had turned his back on centuries of tradition hold his kingdom together in the face of mounting challenges? The romantic allure of Akhenaten's revolution is hard to deny. Pharaoh and his queen reshaping the world in their image is the stuff of legends. Yet, the reality was fraught with economic hardship and social discord. The legacy of Akhenaten's reign was as complex as the man himself, a blend of visionary ambition and pragmatic failure. As we delve deeper into his story, the consequences of his radical reforms will continue to unfold, revealing a tale of intrigue, power, and the fragile nature of revolutionary change. Stay tuned, because the sun disk of Aten is far from setting on this saga. As the sun disk of Aten continued its slow arc across the Egyptian sky, Akhenaten's artistic revolution was unfolding with the same audacity that characterized his religious upheaval. The art of this era, known as the Amarna style, was nothing short of radical. If Egyptian art had been a playlist, Akhenaten hit shuffle and let chaos reign. Traditional depictions of pharaohs and deities, stiff, regal, and eternally youthful, were tossed aside in favor of something bizarrely human. Enter elongated limbs, androgynous features, and yes, even pot-bellies. Was it a stroke of avant-garde genius, or just a fever dream brought on by too much sun? We know ancient Egyptian art loved a bit of symmetry and formality. Think of it as the classical music of visual representation. But Akhenaten cranked up the volume on the weirdness. Figures were stretched like taffy, with exaggerated heads, drooping jaws, and slender waists. No one was spared. Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their brood were all depicted with these peculiar features. In family portraits, they are seen in intimate, oddly relatable scenes, playing with the kids under the watchful eye of the Aten, or sharing a tender moment. For a society used to god kings portrayed as unchanging and unapproachable, this was like switching from a formal portrait to a candid Snapchat story. Now, why the sudden shift? Some scholars suggest this was Akhenaten's attempt to break from the past and humanize the divine. Or maybe he just fancied himself as the Picasso of the Nile. But let's not forget the political undertones. By displaying himself and his family in such a relatable way, Akhenaten was effectively saying, "I'm just like you, only, divine." This wasn't just art for art's sake. It was propaganda with a brush. By choosing to depict the royal family in such a glamorous yet down-to-earth light, Akhenaten was crafting a narrative of accessibility and divinity. It was the ancient equivalent of a royal family Instagram account, carefully curated, purposefully personal. The image of Akhenaten and Nefertiti as doting parents, surrounded by their children, was an attempt to foster a new kind of royal connection with their subjects. But as we know, not everyone was hitting the like button. Now, about those elongated features. Was it merely an artistic style, or did it reflect something more literal? Some theories suggest Akhenaten may have had an actual genetic disorder, such as Marfan syndrome, which could account for his distinctive physical portrayal. But before we diagnose a pharaoh from over 3 millennia ago, let's remember that art is often more about symbolism than realism. The elongated figures might have been a way to emphasize the otherworldliness of the royal family, earthly yet divine. But how did everyday Egyptians feel about these artistic changes? Imagine if all your favorite superheroes were suddenly drawn in a completely new style. Fans would be up in arms. The traditional art forms were deeply tied to religious and cultural identity. This radical departure likely left many scratching their heads or outright disgruntled. The old guards were out, and with them, the old ways of depicting humanity. For some, this was exciting. For others, it was like trying to read hieroglyphs in a funhouse mirror. The real-world consequences of these artistic choices were as complex as the art itself. By glorifying his family and effectively centering them in religious art, Akhenaten was further alienating the traditional power structures. The priesthood, already fuming over the Aten monopoly, saw their sacred iconography replaced with scenes of a royal family picnic, not exactly what they had in mind as divine worship. As for the common folk, the new art style was both a curiosity and a challenge. The shift in representation was more than just an artistic whim. It was a clear signal that the old order had been dismantled and a new one erected in its place. But just like any radical rebranding, not everyone was on board. The seeds of discontent were taking root, nourished by confusion and nostalgia for the stability of the past. The artistic upheaval under Akhenaten wasn't just about aesthetics. It was a microcosm of the broader cultural and societal shifts he imposed. The pharaoh's bold experiment was a double-edged sword, cutting through old traditions while also severing ties with the stability they represented. And while Akhenaten and Nefertiti basked in the glow of their artistic and religious innovations, the cracks in their marble facade were growing wider. In the end, Akhenaten's artistic revolution left a legacy that was as controversial as it was groundbreaking. It challenged norms, redefined beauty, and sparked debates that echo through the ages. Yet, as with all revolutions, the question remains, was it worth the cost? The art of Amarna was a daring leap into the unknown, a testament to the ambitions of a pharaoh who dared to dream differently. But as the Aten's light began to wane, the shadows of dissent grew longer, casting doubt on whether this bold new world could endure. In the world of Akhenaten, art was not just a reflection of life. It was a tool of transformation, wielded with deft ambition and a disregard for tradition. As the story of this enigmatic pharaoh unfolds, the interplay between innovation and resistance will continue to shape his legacy, leaving us to ponder the enduring power of art to inspire change or incite rebellion. While Akhenaten was busy turning art into his personal avant-garde playground, he was also turning Egypt into the ancient equivalent of a diplomatic ghost town. You see, as he was shaking up the religious and artistic status quo, he was also shaking off his kingdom's foreign allies, like a pharaoh with a serious case of ADHD. And here's where things start to unravel faster than a mummy's bandages in a sandstorm. Enter the Amarna letters, an archaeological treasure trove that reads like the ancient world's forgotten inbox. These cuneiform tablets, unearthed from Akhenaten, are essentially the complaints department of the 14th century BC. They are filled with missives from foreign rulers and local governors, all desperately trying to get a hold of the pharaoh who seemed to have left his kingdom on reed. Picture it, Egypt, once the heavyweight champ of the ancient world, suddenly going MIA on the diplomatic scene. The rulers of Mitanni, Babylon, and the Hittites, among others, found themselves ghosted by a pharaoh who was more interested in sun discs than in alliances. The Amarna letters reveal a chorus of frustrated allies wondering why their gold shipments, yes, gold was the currency of friendship back then, weren't being reciprocated. It wasn't just about the bling. It was about maintaining vital political ties that kept the region stable and, more importantly, profitable. Akhenaten's neglect of foreign relations wasn't just a diplomatic faux pas. It was a full-blown geopolitical blunder. Egypt's neighbors were no longer feeling the love, and the consequences were about as subtle as a chariot crash. Without the usual flow of Egyptian gold and support, these kingdoms started to flutter like papyrus in the breeze, looking for stability elsewhere. The Hittites, for example, began to muscle in on territories that were once firm Egyptian allies, sensing an opportunity to expand their influence while the cat was away worshipping the sun. And then there were the internal communications, or lack thereof. The local governors, left to fend for themselves, writing letters that practically screamed, "Hey, Pharaoh, we're still here," and were kind of drowning in a sea of chaos. The vassal states, particularly in Canaan and Syria, were being harassed by their neighbors, and without a firm Egyptian hand to keep things in check, the whole system was starting to collapse like a badly built pyramid. Now, let's talk about the economic fallout from this diplomatic disaster. Akhenaten's religious reforms had already put a strain on the treasury, but his foreign policy, or lack thereof, was the cherry on top of the fiscal sundae. Trade routes that had once been bustling with activity were now as quiet as a tomb. The lack of foreign alliances meant fewer opportunities for trade, which in turn meant less wealth flowing into Egypt. It was the ancient world's version of a stock market crash, and the ripple effects were felt throughout the kingdom. While Akhenaten was busy basking in the Aten's glow, his kingdom was slowly dimming. Isolationist policies he pursued left Egypt increasingly vulnerable. The once mighty empire was now more like a sandcastle, impressive from a distance, but crumbling under the slightest pressure. The political ramifications were clear. Egypt was no longer the indomitable force it had been, and its neighbors were more than ready to exploit any sign of weakness. As the diplomatic chaos unfolded, Akhenaten's domestic policies weren't doing him any favors either. The priesthood, still smarting from their loss of power, were becoming increasingly bold in their opposition. With foreign allies slipping away and internal dissent growing, Akhenaten's grip on his kingdom was about as secure as a reed boat in a storm. And let's not forget the social impact. The Egyptian people, once proud of their nation's might, were starting to feel the pinch. The average Egyptian wasn't just concerned about spiritual matters. They were worried about their livelihoods. The disruption of trade and the loss of foreign allies meant fewer goods in the marketplace and fewer opportunities for prosperity. The discontent was palpable, and while Akhenaten might have been the visionary of his own cult, he was quickly losing followers in the real world. In the end, Akhenaten's reign was a cautionary tale of what happens when revolutionary visions collide with the harsh realities of politics and economics. His religious reforms might have been bold, but they were also blinding, leaving him isolated in a world that was rapidly changing. The Ammon letters stand as a testament to the diplomatic chaos of his reign, a chorus of voices crying out from the past, reminding us of the precarious balance between ambition and pragmatism. As Akhenaten continued to worship his beloved Aten, the kingdom he left behind was slowly unraveling. The cracks in his revolutionary vision were growing wider, and the question of whether his bold experiment could withstand the test of time loomed larger than ever. With each sunset over Akhenaten, the shadows of doubt grew longer, casting a pall over the future of a kingdom once destined for greatness. But the story of Akhenaten is far from over, and as we delve deeper into his legacy, the complexities of his reign will continue to unfold. Stay tuned, because this ancient drama is just heating up. As Akhenaten continued to worship his beloved Aten, the kingdom he left behind was slowly unraveling. The cracks in his revolutionary vision were growing wider, and the question of whether his bold experiment could withstand the test of time loomed larger than ever. With each sunset over Akhenaten, the shadows of doubt grew longer, casting a pall over the future of a kingdom once destined for greatness. But the story of Akhenaten is far from over, and as we delve deeper into his legacy, the complexities of his reign will continue to unfold. Stay tuned, because this ancient drama is just heating up. And so it came to pass that Akhenaten's son, much like the Aten he adored, eventually set. His death around 1336 BC marked the beginning of a rapid unraveling of his monotheistic dreams. The Egyptian elite, who'd been tolerating Akhenaten's sun-disk obsession like a bad haircut, were ready to return to the familiar comforts of polytheism. Think of it as the ultimate religious reboot, with Ammon and the old guards dusting off their thrones and reclaiming the spotlight. The transition was swift and ruthless. Imagine the Aten cult's grand exit as less of a gentle fade and more of a theatrical curtain drop. Akhenaten's successor, likely his son Tutankhaten, soon to be Tutankhamun. Yes, that Tutankhamun took the throne and quickly rebranded himself. Overnight, the young pharaoh changed his name, a move that was as subtle as a chariot charging through a marketplace, signaling a return to the old religious order. Tutankhamun's reign, though short-lived, was a master-class in undoing his father's radical reforms. The temples of Ammon reopened, the priests were back in business, and the statues of the Aten were swiftly relegated to the storeroom of history. Now, let's talk about the erasure of Akhenaten himself, a PR campaign so aggressive it would make Orwell blush. His successors, perhaps fearing the ghost of his monotheistic zeal, embarked on what can only be described as the first-ever historical cancel culture. Akhenaten's name was chiseled off monuments, his images defaced, his city abandoned to the sands. It was as if the ancient Egyptians collectively decided to hit the delete button on an era they'd rather forget. But here's the kicker. Akhenaten's disappearance from the records only fueled the intrigue. Fast forward to the 19th century, when archaeologists stumbled upon the ruins of Akhenaten, and Akhenaten went from forgotten pharaoh to historical enigma overnight. It's an irony sharper than a sphinx's claw. By trying to erase his legacy, his successors inadvertently immortalized him. Today, Akhenaten is more famous than ever, a paradox wrapped in linen, sandwiched between myth and reality. So, why does Akhenaten's reign still captivate us? Maybe it's the romantic allure of a king who dared to challenge the status quo, or the tragic arc of his doomed revolution. Or perhaps it's the human drama, a story of power, ambition, and the inevitable clash between radical change and deep-seated tradition. Akhenaten's tale is a reminder of how history is both shaped by its boldest visionaries and often written by those who sweep up afterward. In the grand tapestry of history, Akhenaten's reign is a bright, albeit short-lived, thread, a testament to the fleeting nature of change in the face of human resilience. His story tells us that while revolutions can alter the course of history, they also tend to leave a trail of chaos that demands resolution. Akhenaten's Egypt was not ready for monotheism, and his attempt to force this change was as successful as trying to sail a papyrus boat upstream. Yet, even in failure, Akhenaten's legacy endures. His reign asks us to consider the price of innovation and the inevitable backlash against it. It invites us to reflect on how societies grapple with change and the comforting allure of the familiar. Akhenaten's story is one of ambition and hubris, but also of the enduring human spirit that seeks to reshape the world, even if only for a moment. As we close the book on this chapter of ancient history, let's remember that Akhenaten's sunlit dreams, though dimmed, continue to cast long shadows across the centuries. His tale is a poignant reminder that while history may be written by the victors, it is often the visionaries, the disruptors, and the dreamers who leave the most indelible marks. In the vast tapestry of medieval Europe, imagine a young girl standing at the intersection of destiny and dynastic drama. That girl is Empress Matilda, born in 1102 to King Henry I of England and his formidable queen, Matilda of Scotland. With a lineage that boasted more political weight than a Game of Thrones family reunion, Matilda's early years were spent in Normandy, a land teeming with castles, political intrigue, and enough chainmail to outfit a small army. Growing up, young Matilda was surrounded by the hustle and bustle of court life. Her father, King Henry I, wasn't exactly a model of fatherly tenderness. This was a man who, according to some accounts, sired over 20 illegitimate children. Clearly, Henry was more about quantity than quality when it came to family. But Matilda had the enviable, or perhaps unenviable, position of being one of his legitimate offspring, which in medieval terms was like holding a VIP ticket to the throne. Now, let's talk about her marriage, because if you're a medieval princess, your wedding is less about finding true love and more about strategic alliances. At the ripe old age of 8, Matilda was betrothed to Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was a solid 16 years her senior. Yes, you heard that right. She was 8. That's younger than most modern-day child actors when they start their careers. But hey, in medieval Europe, age was just a number, and matrimony was a political chess game. When Matilda finally tied the knot in 1114 at the age of 12, she exchanged vows in a ceremony that was more about sealing alliances than sealing lips. Her new husband, Emperor Henry V, was a man who wielded substantial power, ruling over a territory that stretched from present-day Germany to northern Italy. But before we picture Matilda as a damsel trapped in a stone tower, let's give her some credit. She wasn't just a pawn. Matilda wasn't one to sit quietly and embroider tapestries all day. Her time as Empress of the Holy Roman Empire honed her political acumen to a razor-sharp edge. During her marriage, Matilda learned the art of governance, witnessing firsthand the complexities of ruling a vast empire. She developed diplomatic skills that would make modern-day negotiators green with envy. These were not the lessons you got from a medieval version of a correspondence course. They were hard-earned, on-the-job experiences. When Emperor Henry V died in 1125, Matilda was just 23, a widow with the political savvy of a seasoned leader and a fair bit of clout to boot. Returning to England after her husband's death, Matilda found herself in a land simmering with political potential. Her father, King Henry I, now had the task of ensuring his line continued, and with no legitimate male heirs, thanks to the tragic sinking of the White Ship in 1120, which claimed the life of his only legitimate son, William Adelin, Matilda was thrust into the spotlight. For a woman in the 12th century, being named as the heir to the English throne was as groundbreaking as it was contentious. It was like being handed the keys to a kingdom and a powder keg. But Henry I, ever the strategist, didn't just name her heir and call it a day. Oh no, he made the barons of England swear an oath of allegiance to Matilda as the next ruler. Picture a room full of grumpy medieval lords mumbling their vows, fingers crossed behind their backs. The whole setup was like a medieval prenup, just a lot less romantic. As Matilda prepared for her future role, she must have known she was in for the fight of her life. Her father's decision to make her his successor was about as popular as a tax hike, and the English barons were not exactly an easy crowd to please. But Matilda had the determination of a marathon runner who just spotted the finish line. Thus, the stage was set for Matilda's claim to the English throne, a tale that would unfold with all the drama of a Shakespearean play, complete with betrayals, battles, and a cast of characters that would make even the most seasoned historian's head spin. But before we dive into the chaos that was to follow, let's take a moment to appreciate the sheer audacity of it all. In a world where women were often relegated to the sidelines, Matilda was stepping up to play the lead role in one of history's most gripping power struggles. And as we'll see, she wasn't about to let a little thing like tradition stand in her way. As Matilda lined up her ducks, or more accurately, her medieval geese, she knew it wasn't going to be a smooth ride. Her father had barely shuffled off this mortal coil before her cousin, Stephen of Blois, swooped in like a seagull at a seaside picnic, snatching the English crown for himself. Stephen, ever the opportunist, was the kind of guy who would cut in line at a medieval joust if it meant getting ahead. Having already secured the support of the English barons and the Pope, Stephen's coronation in December 1135 was like a medieval mic drop, leaving Matilda fuming in Normandy. Now, you might wonder, why didn't Matilda just roll over and let Stephen play king? Well, she had the tenacity of a honey badger, and a legitimate claim that was about as solid as a Norman castle. Despite Stephen's hasty coronation, Matilda wasn't about to let someone else play with her royal toys while she sat in the corner. So began the aptly named Anarchy, a period of civil war that made the Wild West look like a Sunday school picnic. Let's talk numbers. Medieval warfare wasn't exactly a high-stakes chess game. Armies were often laughably small by modern standards. Picture this. A large force back then might be a few thousand men, the equivalent of a small-town soccer match today. Yet the ambitions were as grand as ever, with each side eyeing the English crown like it was the last slice of medieval pie. Matilda's support came from her half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, a man whose loyalty was as unshakable as a knight's armor. Robert was the kind of guy you'd want in your corner during a bar fight, or, a civil war. Meanwhile, Stephen was busy trying to juggle the English barons, who were about as loyal as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. These barons, with their own local power bases, were more interested in land grabs and personal vendettas than any semblance of national unity. In 1141, Matilda's fortunes took a turn for the better when her forces captured Stephen at the Battle of Lincoln. This wasn't just a skirmish. It was a medieval smackdown that saw Stephen end up in chains, which was about as humiliating as it sounds. With Stephen cooling his heels in captivity, Matilda got a taste of the crown when she was declared Lady of the English. A title that sounds grand, but was about as stable as a house of cards in a windstorm. But let's not pop the champagne just yet. If medieval England even had champagne, which sadly it did not. Matilda's rule was less Game of Thrones and more the office, with her trying to assert control while facing snarky opposition from all sides. Her attempt to be crowned in Westminster was thwarted by a hostile crowd, proving that even in the 12th century, public opinion was a fickle beast. Matilda's claim to the throne was like a medieval episode of Survivor, with alliances shifting faster than you could say feudal loyalty. Perhaps the most legendary episode of this chaotic period was Matilda's escape from Oxford Castle in 1142. Imagine this, Matilda trapped in a besieged castle, surrounded by enemy forces. The winter was harsh, and the situation dire. But instead of surrendering, Matilda pulled off one of history's most daring escapes. Under the cover of night, she and a few loyal knights donned white cloaks to blend in with the snow, sneaking past Stephen's forces and crossing the frozen River Thames to safety. It was the medieval equivalent of a prison break, complete with icy peril and a dash of cloak and dagger drama. Yet, for all the romance of Matilda's escape, the reality was grim. Medieval warfare was a slog, a brutal cycle of sieges and skirmishes, with soldiers living in conditions that would make a modern camper shudder. Supplies were scarce, and the cost of war was felt far beyond the battlefield. Towns and villages were often caught in the crossfire, with their inhabitants suffering from the ravages of war. The economic toll was staggering, with fields left fallow and trade routes disrupted. It was as if the entire country was stuck in a medieval traffic jam, with no end in sight. As the anarchy dragged on, both sides were left battered and weary. Matilda eventually retreated to Normandy, leaving her eldest son, Henry, to pick up the pieces. Stephen was back on the throne, but his reign was as shaky as a medieval ladder. The saga of Matilda and Stephen was far from over, and the road ahead promised more twists and turns than a knight's tournament. But for now, let's leave them in the midst of their chaotic dance, with the English crown still very much up for grabs. The story of Empress Matilda, the woman who dared to defy convention and claim her rightful place in history, was far from finished. Stay tuned, because the next chapter is where things really start to get interesting. And so, as Matilda and Stephen continued their medieval tango of power, the stage was set for yet another legendary escapade. Enter the infamous episode when Matilda had to make a hasty exit from London, dressed as a corpse. Yes, you heard that right. Matilda, the would-be queen, pulling off the medieval equivalent of a Halloween costume to escape her enemies. This was no mere flight. It was a desperate act of survival amidst the anarchy's relentless chaos. Picture London in the 1140, less the bustling metropolis we know today, and more a collection of wooden structures teetering on the edge of chaos. The city was a hotbed of political intrigue, with Matilda's supporters and Stephen's loyalists vying for control like two cats in a sack. Matilda had entered London with the hope of consolidating her power, but her welcome was about as warm as a medieval dungeon, facing an increasingly hostile populace, likely agitated by the ongoing war and the economic hardships it imposed. Matilda knew she had to skip town before things turned as ugly as a medieval tapestry of the plague. Now, to flee a city in medieval England wasn't as simple as hailing an Uber. Matilda's escape plan was more elaborate. The idea was to disguise herself as a corpse being carried out for burial. If this sounds like something straight out of Monty Python, welcome to the twisted reality of 12th century politics. Wrapped in funeral shrouds, Matilda was smuggled past Stephen's forces. It was a gamble as risky as betting your last groat at the local jousting arena, but it worked. Matilda lived to fight another day, proving once again that her tenacity was as robust as a knight's armor. But while Matilda was dodging would-be captors, the real losers in this medieval drama were the common folk. The anarchy had turned England into a land of broken dreams and burnt fields. The economic toll was staggering. With agriculture disrupted, peasants struggled to feed themselves, let alone pay the taxes demanded by their ever-squabbling overlords. Fields lay fallow, trade routes were as safe as a stroll through a dragon's lair, and the average peasant found themselves stuck in a medieval catch-22, work to survive, or fight in a war that made survival uncertain. Noble treachery was at an all-time high, with barons flipping loyalties faster than a jester's somersault. The English countryside was ravaged by bands of marauding soldiers, who took what they wanted and left chaos in their wake. It was the medieval version of a frat party gone wrong, except the cleanup involved more swords and fewer beer cans. Amidst this backdrop, Matilda's political savvy remained her greatest asset. She knew how to play the game, maneuvering through alliances with the finesse of a courtly dancer. Her half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, remained a steadfast ally, providing both military muscle and political support. Together, they strategized like two chess masters, each move calculated to outwit Stephen and his supporters. But Stephen wasn't exactly napping on a feather bed either. He was busy shoring up his own alliances, often using the promise of land and titles as bait. What many people forget about the anarchy is that it wasn't just a war between two rival claimants. It was a war that exposed the deep fractures within the English social and political fabric. Barons were more like mini-kings, each with their own fiefdoms and ambitions. If you think modern corporate politics is ruthless, try navigating a world where betrayal could literally cost you your head. For the English crown, these years were a lesson in humility. The concept of a unified nation under a single ruler was as elusive as a dragon's treasure. To add another layer of complexity, the church played a significant role in this medieval power struggle. Bishops and abbots held sway over vast tracts of land, their influence as much spiritual as it was temporal. Matilda had courted the church's support, but it was a relationship as fickle as a medieval minstrel's tune. The church's blessing could elevate a ruler's legitimacy, but clerical endorsements were often tied to political expediency rather than divine favor. By the time Matilda retreated to the safety of Normandy, the English landscape was a patchwork of allegiances and ruins. The anarchy had left its mark, not just on the land, but on the psyche of its people. Yet despite the setbacks, Matilda remained a formidable figure, her eyes ever fixed on the prize, the English crown. Her legacy was far from complete, and the pieces on the chessboard were still in motion. In the next act of this historical drama, we'll see Matilda's son, Henry, stepping into the fray, armed with the lessons of his mother's trials and the ambition to forge his own destiny. But for now, let's leave Matilda in her realm of strategic retreat, her gaze set firmly on the future. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that the crown is never truly secure until it's resting on your head, or in Matilda's case, until it's resting on her son's head. Stay tuned for more twists, betrayals, and the ultimate quest for power in a world where loyalty was as rare as a dragon's egg and just as precious. The story of Empress Matilda is far from over, and the best, or perhaps the most chaotic, is yet to come. As Matilda settled in Normandy, she might have been half a continent away from the English crown, but she was still very much in the game. Normandy wasn't just a retreat, it was home turf, a political chessboard she knew like the back of her hand. And if medieval politics was a game of thrones, then Normandy was Matilda's well-fortified castle. Let's get one thing straight. Matilda was no wallflower. Her strategic retreat wasn't a sign of defeat. It was a move straight out of a military playbook. Normandy was a powerhouse in its own right, a land rich in resources and ripe for consolidating power. And Matilda, ever the strategist, knew how to use it to her advantage. She may have left England, but she was far from out of sight, out of mind. While the English crown was busy enduring the perpetual whiplash of civil war, Matilda was busy weaving alliances, like an expert seamstress crafting a royal tapestry. Her court in Normandy became a bustling hub of diplomacy, where deals were brokered over mead and mutton, and alliances were sealed with a handshake, or sometimes a marriage vow. Enter Henry, Matilda's son, a young lad with the kind of ambition that would make even the most seasoned politician raise an eyebrow. Born in 1133, Henry was the product of Matilda's second marriage to Geoffrey Plantagenet, Count of Anjou. Talk about a power couple. Between Matilda's royal lineage and Geoffrey's political clout, Henry was practically destined to shake up the medieval world. Now, let's talk numbers, because Henry's rise wasn't just a matter of pedigree. By the time he was 19, Henry had a claim to not one, but 3 thrones: England, Normandy, and Anjou. That's like playing poker with a royal flush when everyone else is bluffing with a pair of 2s. And it wasn't just about thrones, it was about land. Under Henry's eventual rule, the Angevin Empire would stretch from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, covering around 485,000 square kilometers. That's a territory larger than modern-day Germany, all under the control of a single family. But back to Matilda, the ultimate power behind the throne. Her influence on Henry was undeniable, and she schooled him in the art of governance with the precision of a medieval tutor with a laser pointer. Matilda knew the value of alliances, and she taught Henry to cultivate relationships with the same care a farmer tends to his crops. She understood that the English crown wasn't just about wearing a shiny hat. It was about navigating the labyrinthine politics that came with it. Matilda's retreat to Normandy was anything but passive. She used her time wisely, shoring up support among the Norman barons, whose loyalty she cultivated like a gardener tending a prize rose bush. It wasn't just about power, it was about pragmatism. These barons, with their own vested interests and land holdings, were crucial to any claim on the English throne. In the medieval world, having the right people on your side was worth more than a dragon's hoard of gold. While Matilda was busy playing the long game, Stephen was back in England, desperately trying to keep his crown from slipping off his head. His reign might have been marked by chaos and conflict, but Stephen was nothing if not resilient. He spent as much time quelling rebellions and putting out political fires as he did ruling, which meant that England was in a constant state of flux. The barons, those fickle medieval magnates, were more concerned with their own power bases than with whom sat on the throne. Yet, as tumultuous as Stephen's reign was, it provided a valuable lesson for young Henry, who was watching from the sidelines like a hawk eyeing its prey. Henry learned the importance of balancing force with diplomacy, a skill that would serve him well in the years to come. His mother's influence was evident, and as he grew older, Henry began to assert himself more on the political stage. One of the key moments in this saga was the Treaty of Winchester in 1153, an agreement that finally brought some semblance of peace to the turbulent English landscape. By this point, Matilda had retired from the fray, leaving Henry to carry the torch. Stephen, worn down by years of conflict, and perhaps recognizing the writing on the wall, agreed to the treaty, which named Henry as his heir. It was a masterstroke of negotiation, a testament to the power of persistence and strategy over brute force. The Treaty of Winchester was more than a political agreement. It was a turning point in English history. It signaled the end of the anarchy and the beginning of the Plantagenet dynasty, a line that would shape the course of England for centuries to come. With Stephen's death in 1154, Henry ascended to the throne as Henry Roman II, and Matilda's legacy was finally realized. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Matilda's story is about more than just power plays and political maneuvers. It's a tale of resilience and determination, of a woman who refused to be sidelined by the conventions of her time. She was a trailblazer, a woman who navigated the treacherous waters of medieval politics with the skill of a seasoned mariner. Matilda's retreat to Normandy wasn't a retreat from battle. It was a strategic regrouping. She left England with her head held high, her eyes fixed firmly on the future. And while she may not have worn the crown herself, her influence on the English throne was indelible. Through her son, Henry, Matilda's legacy would endure, shaping the course of English history in ways that even she could not have imagined. So, as we wrap up this chapter in Matilda's story, let's take a moment to appreciate the sheer audacity of her journey. She was a woman who defied the odds, who carved out a place for herself in a world dominated by men. Matilda was more than just a claimant to the throne. She was a force of nature, a woman whose story continues to captivate and inspire. Stay tuned, because in the next part, we'll delve into the reign of Henry Roman II and the lasting impact of Matilda's legacy. We'll explore how the lessons of the past shaped the future, and how the seeds sown by Matilda bore fruit in ways that would change the course of history forever. The story of Empress Matilda is far from over, and the best is yet to come. As Henry Roman II took the throne, the echoes of Empress Matilda's influence resounded through the halls of power, a testament to the indelible mark she made on English history. Matilda might not have worn the crown herself, but her fingerprints were all over it. Her life was a masterclass in political resilience, a medieval playbook for anyone attempting to navigate the treacherous waters of leadership in a man's world. And let's face it, she was playing on expert mode in a game designed with all the cheat codes in favor of the other gender. Now, let's pause for a reality check. The legend of Empress Matilda often paints her as a proto-feminist icon. a medieval Joan of Arc without the armor, leading her forces with a rallying cry and a wave of her sword. But the reality, it was less about grand speeches and more about the gritty, relentless grind of diplomacy, warfare, and survival. Matilda wasn't some fairy tale heroine waiting for a knight in shining armor. She was the one darning the metaphorical armor, determined to secure her rightful place and ensure her lineage's future. Fast forward to the establishment of the Plantagenet dynasty, and you see Matilda's strategic brilliance bearing fruit. Her son, Henry Roman II, wasn't just any king. He was the architect of an empire that spanned vast swaths of Europe. The numbers tell the tale. From Scotland to the Pyrenees, the Angevin Empire covered more territory than any other realm in Western Europe at the time, a whopping 485,000 square kilometers. Matilda's legacy was not just in the bloodline, but in the geopolitical landscape she helped shape. But let's debunk some myths while we're here. The notion of Matilda as a solitary female figure fighting against a world of male adversaries is as oversimplified as it is dramatic. Yes, she faced tremendous challenges, but she wasn't alone in her struggle. Her half-brother Robert of Gloucester was her steadfast ally, and her marriage to Geoffrey of Anjou was a strategic alliance that bolstered her political clout. It was a medieval power couple arrangement, with Geoffrey holding down the fort in Anjou while Matilda maneuvered through the English political quagmire. And speaking of quagmires, let's talk economics. The anarchy, that chaotic period of civil war, wasn't just a political mess. It was an economic disaster. The English countryside was ravaged, with fields left untilled and villages reduced to cinders. The economic toll was brutal, and it would take years for the realm to recover fully. This wasn't just a backdrop for Matilda's story. It was a crucial factor in her struggle for power. In the end, her ability to navigate the economic and political wreckage left by the anarchy was as important as her claim to the throne itself. As for Matilda's impact on modern perceptions of women in power, her story is a compelling reminder of the complexities faced by women leaders throughout history. She was a trailblazer, no doubt, but not in the way mythmakers would have us believe. Her legacy isn't just about breaking glass ceilings. She was about building new structures entirely. Her life underscores the reality that power, especially for women, has always been a game played with different rules and higher stakes. Matilda's story also serves as a cautionary tale about the seductive allure of myths. The romanticized narratives often overshadow the grit and grind that defined her life. Sure, it's tempting to see her as a medieval superhero, but the truth is far more nuanced. She was a woman of her time, constrained by its limitations, yet fiercely determined to transcend them. Her legacy is a testament to the power of persistence, strategy, and the unyielding belief in one's right to lead. As the Plantagenet dynasty took root, the echoes of Matilda's life reverberated through the ages. Henry Roman II's reign marked the beginning of a new chapter in English history, one shaped by the lessons learned from his mother's trials and tribulations. Matilda's impact was felt not just in the halls of power, but in the very fabric of medieval society, challenging the status quo and redefining what it meant to wield power in a world that wasn't quite ready for her. So, as we draw the curtain on Empress Matilda's story, let's remember her as she was, a formidable force of nature, a woman who dared to defy the conventions of her time and whose legacy continues to inspire. She may not have worn the crown herself, but her influence was as enduring as the castles that dotted the landscape of her beloved England and Normandy. In the end, Matilda's life was a saga of ambition, resilience, and relentless pursuit of what was rightfully hers. She was more than a footnote in history. She was a harbinger of change, a woman whose story reminds us that the path to power is rarely straightforward, but oh, is it ever worth the fight. And as we close the book on her tale, we can only imagine what she would make of her enduring legacy, a legacy that, much like the crown she sought, has stood the test of time.